We are live. Okay. So welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us. We have an evening of empowering and educating for you. And what I wanted to do was just begin the evening with a little bit of an introduction. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Jo Grady. I'm the General Secretary of UCU. And one of the things that we are here to do this evening is to really celebrate the importance and the diversity of post-16 education. And that is all the way from our prison members who deliver education to all manner of different people, who teach them to read and teach music. And we're going to be hearing from one of those members later, to people who do research, on cutting edge vaccines such as coronavirus vaccines. And we're really here to talk about the whole gambit. And one of the reasons that we're here to discuss that this evening is because we are massively under attack. Educators in the UK are massively under attack. People who work in educational institutions are under attack, not just by this government, but actually by parts of the media as well. And what we want to do is really educate people about what is happening in our sectors in post-16 education, but also really empower you to help us in the campaign that we are currently running to really lobby the government for the change that we need. And the backdrop to all of this is what's already happening in education and the cuts that are already happening. Because what really hasn't come through yet is just how substantial the cuts are in education. No other sector is seeing the kind of damage that is being done, particularly at this moment in time, to higher education. Higher education was already one of the worst sectors for precarious employment. And in this moment, and particularly since April, since we got into lockdown, higher education institutions are moving to slash jobs. Employers everywhere in higher education are looking to cut budgets for sessional staff. They're refusing to renew fixed-term contracts when they should be extending them during the whole duration of this crisis. And we've seen nearly 5,000 fixed-term contracts that have already been lost. And we're here tonight to talk about why those jobs need to be reinstated and why we need to work as hard as possible to ensure that the thousands more that universities have put under immediate risk in this country are protected. And we're starting to see these things that I've just outlined in higher education happening in further education too. So this is not isolated. This is not going to stay in one sector. And what we are here to say is if the government does not get behind this campaign, things are going to get worse. So what's really important to us is that everybody watching here gets behind what we're doing, lends us their support, and really moves forward the public discourse about post-16 education. Because I think it's fair to say that the type of discourse and debate that happens around post-16 education in this country is not of a high quality. If we look at the statements that have come out from the government in the past week, they're full of comments such as too many people go to university, or too many people are studying subjects that they're interested in when they should be focused on getting a job. And our sector's not alone for being denigrated. But what we're here to showcase this evening is that we have supporters everywhere. And that education is about much more than something transactional that you purchase for a job. It's about changing communities. It's about transforming minds. And ultimately what our Fund the Future campaign is about it's about building for better. And there is some press releases and some stories that you'll be able to see tomorrow morning, which really demonstrates how important what we do is. We have been polling some constituencies around the UK, and the results from these polls that we've had really demonstrate that you, the public, our supporters, understand just how much education matters to local communities. What we've seen is voters in 30 key battleground university constituencies back government funding to protect universities from the impact of COVID-19. So we need our sectors to be safeguarded. And what we want to do this evening is inspire you, if you haven't already, to join our campaign and to help us make the future better, rather than to accept what the government is pushing forward our way, which is, more cuts to funding, more struggles for staff in universities and colleges and adult education providers and in prisons. So we have a whole range of programmes for the forthcoming weeks and over the summer. There is one later this week, which I will be taking part in again. The links are going to get posted on our social media. You can see all of the events. It's at fundthefuture.org.uk/events. And later this week, we have an event on the Green New Deal. That's on Thursday. It's around about lunchtime, I think. And you can find that on our events page. What we are asking people to do in this moment, though there'll be more calls to action next week, is to put a lot of pressure on your local MP. We have all manner of resources on the webpage if you want to go along and look for things that you can do. We need to create as much noise as possible to really draw people's attention to what is happening in education. There have been examples over the last week of the massive amounts of redundancies across the UK and across many different sectors that will occur because of COVID. We've seen devastating news to people who work at John Lewis, people who work for Pret, people who work for British Airways. What we are seeing, particularly in universities, are the same amount of job losses for an organisation potentially happening or being put under threat at one university. We've seen potential job losses at Manchester, at Sussex, at Blackburn College. If you go on our website, you'll see that there's petitions for those local campaigns. I would really urge you to get behind them. There's many more than just those three. But we really need the public support, because what we are hearing is that they want to pitch particularly higher education against further education. They want to turn education into even more of a marketplace than it already is. Whereas what we are saying, and what this evening is about celebrating, is that education is so much more than that, that people who work in education are so much more than just, careers, trainers for students. And we really want to demonstrate this evening the full impact of what we can deliver. So I'm just going to run you through the evening we've got in stall. I hope you can hang around for all of it, but if not, there's just bits you can tune into. In a few minutes' time, I'm going to be passing over to Vicky Blake, who is UCU's president. She's going to be hosting a session until 7 o'clock, which we've called Building for Better. And we want to discuss a number of issues that are facing us, not just what life will be like after COVID, the impact of Black Lives Matter, and also the climate crisis. Vicky has an amazing set of speakers with her. And we've also got some UCU members on our panel as well, which I think is really important, that people who actually work in education can talk about what's happening. Then there will be a session with me for half an hour. Dave Ward, who is the General Secretary of the CWU, is coming to chat with me for half an hour, and we're going to be talking about the importance of inter-union solidarity and a new deal for workers, and how we can all work better together to achieve the things that we want to. At 7:30 till 8 o'clock, we have got Billy Bragg joining us. He'll be joined with Justin, who's another one of our UCU members who's taking part in tonight's event with us, who teaches music. And that panel will be chaired by Janet Farrer, who is our president-elect of UCU. And then finally, if you're still with us at 8 o'clock, you'll be back with me for the final event of the evening, which is Empower and Educate, Delivering Social Justice. And again, we've got some great speakers in that session with me, Faiza Shaheen, Sonia Desera, and Gary Young. And we really will be talking about really the ability of education to develop people's capacities, to challenge them, to communicate values, and how people who work within education are more than a cost to be minimised, and really what a post-16 education system that delivers social justice could look like, and how it could allow both staff and students to flourish. So if you're with us for the long haul, settle in. There's the ability to obviously comment on social media. We'll be trying to pick out some of those comments and involve them in the discussions. But otherwise, sit back, enjoy the evening, and please, there'll be various calls to action throughout the evening that we'll be asking you to take part in to help the campaign, but also other types of petitions. And one final thing I will say, if you do enjoy this evening and you think that there's been a real benefit to you from taking part, we are always looking for donations to our Fighting Fund for UCU. So if you go to our webpage, you'll see a link and you can click and donate if you enjoy the evening and show some solidarity that way. But I won't take up any more time of Vicky's session, so I will hand over to Vicky Blake, our president, who can introduce the first panel. Hi.
Hi. So this is my first time on one of these, so let's hope I get this right. I'm really glad to be here tonight, and I think the whole programme is just really going to showcase exactly how important education is, but also get us thinking about how education works in different ways, how education is important throughout the whole life cycle of everybody. It's not something that we can ever afford to stop doing. And as Jo has said, this campaign is about building for better. It's about, what does that mean? That means building for a better society, one that has more equality of access to education and for the sorts of opportunities that education can bring us, and about listening to each other and building a better society, one that is safer, is more just. So we are joined for this section, which is going to be about 50 minutes long, by 4 incredible speakers. We have Grace Blakely, Dahlia Gabriel, Anne Pettifor and Charmaine Brown. What I'm going to ask you to do is just to say a couple of words about yourselves as you join us, and we're going to sort of frame the conversation around a few key questions, really thinking about the themes of how activism and education work together, how activism can be a form of education and vice versa. And so the whole sort of section that we're doing now is thinking about how activism can be informed by, but also how it can shape feminism, economics, how we understand geography, the decolonization of our institutions of education, and how all of this can be brought together to change and shape and transform our communities to build that better society that we all want to live in. So I'm going to ask each of you on the panel to just briefly say hello and a little bit about yourself, and then to spend about a minute just thinking about what is your most significant learning experience. So what sticks out in your mind? So if it's okay, can we start with Grace?
Can you hear me?
We can, yes.
Yeah, good. Sorry, I was muted for a second there. So hi everyone, I'm Grace Blakely. I am a staff writer at Tribune Magazine, author of my latest book, Stolen: How to Save the World from Financialization. And I have 2 other books coming out this year with Verso, one of which is called Futures of Socialism, which Dahlia has actually contributed to. And it's a collection of essays just looking at the kind of the future for the socialist movement in the UK and around the world, with some brilliant essays in there. And another one about the coronavirus pandemic coming up in September. So plugs over. Was that, Vicky, you wanted us to say something just about our experiences of education? I think the thing that always stands out to me when I talk about my education is just how unbelievably boring and stale the PPE degree was at Oxford. That's politics, philosophy and economics that I did as my undergraduate degree. And just, it was kind of, it's basically, they've been teaching everyone the same things for the last 300 years. And it was built as a mechanism to churn up bureaucrats to help to build the British Empire. So it was only after that when I went from PPE to my master's, which was in African studies, that I really felt like I was getting access to a kind of really critical perspective on the global economy, because you were looking at it from the perspective of kind of the most marginalized. So it was really my tutors and lecturers in that master's course that helped me to break out of a lot of the kind of boxes that I think maybe my previous education had created for me.
Thank you. And I'm going to ask Charmaine next. So again, just please say a little bit about yourself and tell us a little bit about your most significant learning experience that you've had.
Okay, yes. Just to say, I'm a senior lecturer at the University of Greenwich, and I'm a community activist on issues pertaining to my community. I'm also a legal activist. In terms of positive experiences, I can say being an undergraduate, doing a joint honours degree in politics, economics with French and Spanish, and the experience abroad, actually in the French and Spanish universities, in the political climate when Klaus Barbie was on trial in Lyon, and I was actually studying there, political sciences. And it's just been part of something that was historical, but also current. That was a very positive experience. And being able to apply that current experience to my learning at the time. So it made the degree a lot more dynamic than this part of the degree that I'd started, because you started off in the UK, you went abroad and came back to UK to finish. And just being, it was like it was contextualized. All I'd studied in politics was actually contextualized by being in Lyon at the time of the trial of Klaus Barbie and the resurgence of Jean-Marie, and the appointment of Marie Le Pen. So it was very topical, and that was very exciting and positive.
Thanks so much. And Dalia, can we come to you next?
Yep. Hi, can you all hear me all right? Great. Yeah, so I would say that my sort of most significant educational experience was when one form of education clashed with a different form of education. So when I went to Oxford as well, but I did just did a 9-month master's, so I wasn't kind of steeped in it as much. While I was there, I got involved in the first iteration of the Rhodes Must Fall campaign. We were organizing around that statue in about 2015. And I'm not sure if you guys remember, but it was, we were public enemy number one. Like, the audacity, the kind of the imagery of a bunch of, Black and brown students trying to change literally the infrastructure of this university was seen as uppity. It was seen as kind of entitled, etc. And that's when I really understood how the knowledge that I had about Britain's empire and what it meant in the world, which was gained from growing up in South London in a very multiracial neighborhood and school, where talking and joking about the empire was something that was a way that we produced knowledge and understood the world amongst ourselves, the stories and stuff that we would be told by our grandparents, etc. And then, so having that kind of education in that sort of community oral education and having it come into conflict with the Oxford produced education, and sort of having that was very much a massive wake-up call for me about actually the centrality and how political education is. Whether or not it's described as political education or not, it is politicized. So that was kind of, for me, a moment where I really began to reflect on the sort of political economy of knowledge, as it were.
Thanks. And this is, I've just wondered if you could say a little bit about yourself, Dalia. I know you're a PhD student and I guess
Yeah, so I'm doing a PhD at the moment in at LSE. I'm doing it on economic and urban geography. So I'm looking at work, which is, I find that looking at gig economy workers and being something that is becoming more gig economy like, which is, a lecturer, a student, a GTA. It's been very interesting. So now, I do research on work, precarious work, but I also have done activism stuff around climate change and all that good stuff. So, yeah.
Thanks so much. And Anne, I'd love for you to introduce yourself and just say a little bit as well about your most significant learning experience or something that sticks out for you.
Right. So my name is Anne Pettifor, and I was one of the original Green New Deal group back in 2007-8, together with Caroline Lucas and Jeff Tiley, who's now at the TUC. And we produced this Green New Deal, which had a very slow burn start, but which took off when Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez picked it up. And then last year, I published a book called The Case for the Green New Deal. I think my most significant learning experience was really to discover how dishonest the education system was, if you like, or how the racism, for example, of a society is deeply embedded in an educational system. And how, for example, now the market is now deeply embedded in the educational system. And the way in which the educational system sort of absorbs these ideologies. I grew up in South Africa. I went to university at Wits in Johannesburg. And it was stunning realizing how deeply embedded was racism in our education, in higher education, as well as, of course, in the world around us. So that was a very long time ago. But the point is, what I think I'd like to say here is that I've worked on the sovereign debt of the poorest countries, and in trying to understand why they've got into such levels of debt, I had to try and understand the economic system that had created those debts. And to understand the economic system, I had to learn to understand money and credit. And I discovered, and this was late in life, but I discovered that actually the economics profession doesn't understand money. And it was quite a shock, actually. I mean, there have been economists since the 1600s who have understood the nature of money, but today's economists don't. And that's something that tells you something about an education system that can have such a massive blind spot or a deliberate barrier, if you like, towards ideas. And so for me, the education system is so profoundly important in changing those values and in transforming those ideas instead of absorbing them and just accepting them. So really, that's what's important to me.
Thanks so much. And you've all done such a brilliant job of answering that question. You've led perfectly into the next part of the conversation that we wanted to have with you. Thinking about the current situation that we're in and the way that coronavirus has not only exposed injustice that is deeply entrenched in our society, but also exacerbated it, the way that it's kind of really uncovered and worsened the situation for a lot of people. And thinking about some of the other campaigning things that have kind of come to the fore during this time, I'd like to ask you to think a bit about how you've all just spoken about a certain kind of tension that you've experienced in education. And as we've seen some of the comments coming in from the chat from people watching this as well, we've seen comments from people saying things like, you know, they were told in their lectures that colonialization, you know, it was needed, India needed colonizing, all these kinds of awful things that have been spoken about and kind of entrenched into people's education. I'd like to ask you to think about education as a force for change, but also how we can affect change in education, and to think a bit about how activism and education can help us to challenge and change things like that entrenched institutional racism that is in our education system, that is in our healthcare, is in our prisons, and how it seeps into the public spaces. I mean, Grace, you were talking about Rhodes Must Fall campaign, and that's obviously come to the fore again through the Black Lives Matter movement. And I originally grew up quite near Bristol, so you can imagine the felling of the Colston statue is something that had a huge impact on the communities near where I grew up, but that's had ramifications through society, and we've seen more and more of these symbols of injustice and of oppression being challenged. I'd just be really interested to hear what you think about how we can take hold of this and really use it to challenge how we do education and to make education more accessible. And I don't really have a sort of order in mind, so I think maybe I might ask Dalia if you'd like to start on thinking about that, and we'll just take it in quite a conversational way.
Yes, so there are kind of 2 points that I want to make, and like what the first of them is kind of quite related to as Anne Pettifor was talking about, sort of the marketization of education, and sort of what impact, what does that do to the project of decolonizing the university? So there is no such thing as a decolonized private university. Like, it just doesn't work. It doesn't make any sense, both in terms of the material structure of the university and how, you know, privatization necessarily leads to, you know, the hierarchization of like who gets to go to university and who doesn't, and who gets to produce knowledge and who doesn't. But I think also when you cut education down to its bare bones, when you make it so that certain lecturers, certain courses, certain forms of research only get legitimized or funded if they are able to have some kind of market-oriented output, what you're doing is you are restricting the landscape of what can be understood as knowledge and what can be understood as education. And going back to when I talked about the kind of education that I had from my relatives and from my neighborhood, and how that kind of operates and comes into, you know, clashed very hard with institutional education. There is what I am seeing is a restricting of the space that within which researchers and educators and teachers can operate. And when you're dealing with marginalized histories and marginalized epistemologies, where, you know, concepts of the archive and concepts of things like that are not as straightforward as it is for sort of the more mainstream histories that we have been taught, that kind of restriction of what can be done in the research space is really harmful to the consecration, the circulation of alternative, more marginalized knowledge and epistemologies. But in terms of the Rhodes Must Fall movement, I think for us, that was really about, it was about understanding the statue as a metaphor for how we relate to the empire, and not just how we relate to empire in terms of what we know to be true of the empire, but also how the empire has shaped the contemporary world in all spheres of life, whether it's healthcare, housing, borders, geopolitics, etc. And for us, the statue was really a symbol about a relationship with empire that exists in a very kind of monolithic way. It exists in a way that is both hyper invisible and yet completely invisible. We walk past that statue every single day. It's sort of right on the street, and yet no one knows who that statue is of and what the history of that statue is and what it comes to represent. Much like that is the reality of empire and racism and slavery, which is ever present and ever visible in our world, and yet it is unnamed, it is invisibilized. And for us, that's really what it meant to bring that statue down. And I think what I'm worried about is that institutions are going to see the removal of statues as a replacement for redressing that educational and material injustice that has been occurring through our institutions of education. And also, I think that when it comes to kind of, as I mentioned before, the kind of political nature of education, in myself and Gurminder Bhambre and Kerem Nishanjolu, who are all kind of decolonial educators, we published a book a few years ago. And in the chapter that I wrote for that, I talked about how every time they tried to revise the national curriculum the history national curriculum in the UK, in schools, so again, it's not just higher education, but secondary and primary, there is a huge political uproar. So, you know, Michael Gove, the first thing the Tories did when they came into power was try to change the history and English curriculum. Again, in the 70s, we see this massive political contestation about what is included in the history and English curriculum. And what that tells us is that the narratives and stories that we're told of how our world came to be and how that narrative relates to our history of empire and slavery is seen as an incredibly contemporary, impactful issue. So when they say that we are trying to politicize education, the reality is that education is always political. We just have to be transparent and fight for the politics that we believe in to underpin our education system, which is one of liberation, of rigor, and of equality, essentially.
Thanks so much, Dalia. And what you're saying really makes me think about what Charmaine said earlier. You know, you were talking about the importance of context and how a shift in context could help you to think about how things might be different. And I wonder, how do you approach this question of how activism and education can help us to challenge and change the kinds of injustices that we're talking about, and how do we impact some sort of change on how education is done in that way?
All right, I'd just like to say that I'm a member of the Windrush generation, having been born in Jamaica and came to the UK when Jamaica was still part of the British Empire. And for me, I take on board all what Dalia's just said. But I also want to add, for me, it's always the students' activism is about empowerment. Education is about empowerment, and activism is about empowerment. And I really feel that the student's voice is lost in all of what's been happening with all these issues that education is trying to advance. So it's a contradiction that you're a student and gaining knowledge, and you should be able to contest certain aspects of knowledge that's been delivered that are colonialist mindsets, but you're not given that space. So for me, I'm looking to the student experience, and I think that we need to be in terms of activism, we need to create a space where in any institution, students are able to discuss things that they're not happy with or fey with, and contest anything they find is not conducive to their learning. And this doesn't really happen because there's always a sense of who can I trust. So even with us as academics, students do not have the confidence to feel they can impart certain ideas or issues that they have. And especially I see now with this Black Lives Matter movement, people have to go into discrete spaces to discuss issues. They cannot openly be activists when trying to contest what's happening. Even the decolonization agenda, they have to do it in little silos, and it cannot come to the attention of the educators because they'll be penalized. And I just want to draw on the work of a colleague of mine, Professor Paul Miller, and he's done extensive work on social justice as activism, and he has a 3-point model which talks about, one of the ones I'm interested in is the pedagogic activism, which talks about challenging and supporting other education professionals to use their position to represent and safeguard the interests of students, and to help students negotiate and navigate complex systems and processes. Now, this is very difficult when you look at some of the leadership in academic institutions and the general policies that they have to follow in order to engage funding. It's very hard to break that barrier as a student to have a meaningful voice in education. So for me, activism would be to give the students that voice and give them the opportunities to discuss things that they are not comfortable with, or where they think change should happen. But in order to do that, we have to look at the systemic racism and the structure of higher education, the structure of education as a whole. And until we can tackle that, then we cannot get to the heart of the matter, which for me is always the students.
Thanks so much. And I think what you're saying is very much echoing, isn't it? There's a challenge to how education has been seen in some quite traditional formats to what it can actually be about, and how that power to transform can be harnessed. And I wonder, Anne, if we could think about what you were saying about, you mentioned that you came to economics, later on, and about the way that equipped you to kind of challenge ideas and to understand better and to even ask questions about what it is that economists actually know. And how is it that connects, do you think, to the challenges that we've got? I mean, we're talking about the way that this crisis that we're in at the moment has highlighted other crises. So we're talking about the decolonizing of curriculums and public spaces that's encountering that kind of resistance that people are also putting up as we try to change our institutions. But it's also the case for the climate crisis. And I know that you've spoken a little about that. And I wonder if you could say a little bit more about how kind of getting the new tools, if you like, of education can help you crack open some of those boxes.
Gosh, Vicky, that's quite a lot to come back on. But I'm going to say, first of all, I think it's really hard to transform education from within the system, right? After the financial crisis, 2007-9, kind of a student movement grew up, rethinking economics, that wanted to challenge the orthodoxy that's so dominant in the university. You're not allowed to teach anything else except economic orthodoxy. You're not allowed to research anything. When I was working on the sovereign debt crisis before 2000, and students at the London School of Economics wanted to do a master's in sovereign debt, they were told, no, debt is irrelevant. It's not really an important thing. and they were told they could not do masters or PhDs in that subject. That was extraordinary to me, and we had huge rows about that. But the thing that struck me about the rethinking economics movement was that those students challenged the ideology, but when it came to the crunch, they had to write the exams, and they had to pass the exams because they had to get a job at the end of that, right? And a lot of them wanted to have a job in the City of London. So the thing never went really far. And I'm not blaming anyone here, because I just think it's impossible. You know, when you know that these are the answers you have to get a degree, to give the wrong answers and not get a degree is a kind of self-subversive activity. And so I found that difficult to think about. And I want to take us back to, look, we have to have political transformation. And I feel strongly at the moment about this, but it's about time that we people who care about colonization, imperialism, about the marketization of our society, about the ideology of economic systems and so on, went for political power. I mean, I've been an activist. I've worked in social movements. I've led a social movement that was profoundly effective. But nothing really happens until you reach the level of political power. And we have to want to have political power to transform the system, as well as to fight to get it. And the fight is ugly, really, and it's difficult. So empowerment is good, is a great thing to do, but it's not enough. We need to grab the levers of political power. Now, the right have no problem whatsoever for that ambition. They know that's what they want. They go for it. They don't care a damn about anything else. They know if they get hold of the institutions, they run them, then, you know, whatever we bleat and moan about is not going to be serious. So I come back. We need to get political. We need to be political. And that means being involved in political parties, whichever one we choose. And then what was your second question, Vicky? It was another big question and I've forgotten it already.
I was kind of asking us, it was picking up on that theme of how we challenge.
About climate. And it was about climate, wasn't it? Yes. Now, the thing is this, that it's very clear to me that the most important thing we have to do to tackle the climate is to reskill ourselves and to re-educate ourselves. You know, we've seen what's happened in this pandemic, that we really don't have the science, the proper science that we need, and we don't have it in places where we really need it. We have a huge disrespect and a contempt for experts, really. But we also have some experts that have made some very, very big mistakes. You know, the experts told us at the beginning of this pandemic that we shouldn't wear masks, really. That's shocking. Even then, I thought that was wrong, right? So we have a big problem on that level. But there's another level, which is that we've got to reskill our whole society to transform our society away from its addiction to fossil fuels. We're going to have to reskill everybody that works in the steel industry, in the fossil fuel industry, in airline industries. These people have got to be reskilled and be given the really urgent task of transforming our transport systems, our energy systems, our land use systems, but also our system of caring, which is women's work, really, and mainly Black women's work, I have to say. So in this country. So I think that the urgent need for this means that we really have to demand the expansion of the education system, higher education, further education. They should not be competing. We need both really to expand to help prepare us for this calamity and for the transformation of our economy. So I'm passionate about that. And, you know, I think that's why we have to win this battle. And that's why we have to get political power to do that.
So I'm going to try and cleverly, I don't know if this is going to work, weave together what you've just said with a comment that came up on the screen just now and kind of go back to what, Grace, you said right at the start about the way that you felt that your education was kind of very much in boxes when you first did your undergraduate degree and kind of breaking out of those boxes. Now, the comment that we had that flashed up just now came from someone who said that their favourite educational experience was as an undergrad in an experiential education programme in Vermont, where the assignment was to interview a local community group. Oh, great, it's come up on the screen now. And this person, Siobhan, interviewed people from the Nurses Union, conducting the interview at a bar, and says that their political economic critique was incredibly sharp and they kept saying that they could be quoted with all the profanities included. And I think that it's one of those things, isn't it, where there are certain ideas that we take with us from when we're first entering formal education about how it is and how it should be, and that impacts the question of what research is and what research can be. And Grace, I'd be really interested in some comments from you around the question that we've been looking at, around how education and activism can work together to help us challenge these injustices that have been particularly exposed by the coronavirus crisis. And then when you've kind of given your answer to that, I'm going to try and sneak us into the next question. So take it away. Thank you.
Yeah, no, that was a great setup to that question, I think, because I have definitely had very similar experiences as to the woman asking that question, whether it's in, doing research as an undergrad or during my master's, or actually the most recent experience has been just like touring all around the country, around a couple of countries actually, with my book, and hearing people ask questions, and those questions being so much more incisive and just really cutting to the core of the issues that I'm trying to interrogate than any of the treatment that I'd get, often surrounded by mainstream professional economists or MPs or whoever else. And I think that just speaks so much to what we've been hearing about, which is just the way in which what we understand as knowledge, what we see as legitimate forms of knowledge, is informed by power and really by ideology. And you see that so clearly in the economics profession, as Anne's just been saying. I write from the perspective of a Marxist economist, and Marx is not something that I learned about at university, right? This is not something you are ever really likely to learn about at university, despite this being a really important way of understanding capitalism. You don't have to be a Marxist to understand that Marx highlights a huge number of very important facts and ideas about the capitalist economy. Take one example. Neoclassical economists, mainstream economists treat businesses as a black box. So they don't really look at the relations of production. They don't look at what goes on inside firms. Whereas Marxist analysis centers on relations of production, and therefore has this idea about class being a really important structuring dynamic under capitalism. Do you own the means of production, or don't you own the means of production, right? So, just these assumptions that we make about the world obviously really go on to inform what we see and what we don't see, what we see as legitimate knowledge, what we see as illegitimate knowledge. And that obviously, massively plays out in universities, in our education system. I definitely found this at Oxford, right, where the economics curriculum was, it was differentiation of utility functions, budget constraints. It was basically like glorified maths. And we were told, these are the assumptions that we're making about the world. Human beings are rational, utility maximizing objects. There are no classes. We don't look at what happens in the firm. We don't look at production. We just see people as kind of these little atoms bumping up against one another in free markets, and you're going to study their behavior. And it's not simply that, these are the only ideas that you're taught. It's that these are the ideas you're taught are legitimate, because all the clever people around you that are teaching you, everyone on the news, everyone that you look up to, everyone that you read, is speaking in this language, is using this discourse. And to feel accepted, you feel like you have to adopt this discourse. And that goes for economics. So, we're talking about whether or not you can basically be a Marxist in the economics profession, which, to be honest, I don't really think that you can at this point. You would get, shunted into politics or, another area. And it also, I think, speaks to some of the other issues we've been hearing about here, which is, how do we talk about empire? How do we talk about colonialism? How do we talk about race? What are the legitimate frameworks that we can use to discuss these issues whilst being seen as respectable arbiters of knowledge, whilst being invited on the news, right? And so often that is, the frame that is used is a fairly ahistorical, apolitical frame that is like, we see this all the time. It's like, oh, I said a racist thing, I'm going to go do some unconscious bias training and then it'll be fixed. Or this statue's been pulled down, so we fixed racism, right? It's all about symbols. It's all about individualizing and kind of personalizing these responses. And we're just not taught to analyze and interrogate the power structures that create and reproduce the world that we live in. And, you know, that goes for the world that we're educated in as much as the world that we work in, you know, exist in the rest of the time. I think that is really what it comes down to, is the question of how are we learning about power? Because power is something that is so obvious once you've seen it and once it is exercised over you. But without being taught it, if you're kind of continuing to live in a fairly kind of liberal, uncritical frame, it's very difficult to see where that power is coming from and how it's being used and who's using it. So, you know, and education is the way that we shine a light on those power structures. And to be honest, I've learned probably more in my experience of being in the Labour movement, in and around the Labour Party, in and around activist circles over the past 5 years than I probably did during my entire undergrad PPE degree, which is a big claim, but I would be willing to put that on the PPE prospectus for anyone who is considering going to do it.
Thanks so much. And what you've just said, I would like to come back to what Charmaine was saying earlier about empowering the student. Obviously, the theme of today is empowering and educating in that kind of together sort of way. And Charmaine, I know that you have a particular area of expertise around education policy, and you'd be very well placed to tell us about the impact of cuts to education, maybe particularly adult education, because we're looking at a situation where we're talking about how important it is to empower the student to have that more democratic sort of education system. And yet so many people are excluded, and we're seeing huge cuts to education across the board. And I wondered if you wanted to comment on that and how that impacts on the ability of education as a tool of empowerment.
Well, I should say that because of the cutbacks, the education curriculum has become very narrow. So you study a course just to pass an exam and to get an accreditation. So there's not much personal and professional development within education as I see it. Also, the teachers have been, because of the education policies that have come into place since 1992 with the Further and Higher Education Act, I can actually say teachers have been deprofessionalized on a level that's never happened before. So they don't have that power that they used to have to interpret curriculums and contextualize curriculum and make it very meaningful or more meaningful to students' lives. When I started teaching, I used to teach literacy and ESOL. And at the time, it was linked to the political climate. So when there was social unrest or political unrest in one country or the other, that generated refugees and asylum seekers to the UK, and I used to teach on bespoke courses, for example, Kurdish refugees, when there was a political unrest in Sri Lanka, and the Tamil versus the Senegalese, and I used to teach bespoke. And then when you did classes, you actually thought about the political context, and you would make sure you addressed issues that were meaningful to students' lives, but within the context of the accreditation that you're teaching. Now that's all been stripped with the new education policies, and you just literally teach for them to again. Also, when I taught literacy and ESOL, I was very much influenced by Paulo Freire and critical consciousness. So you taught with the fact that you're empowering students not only to learn what they needed to learn, but actually gives them a wider context so they can navigate and they could actually be able to do things that they needed to do to survive in a country that was not their own, within a new language structure, within a new political structure. So I'd run parents and children workshops, because at the time the children might have grasped English language a lot quicker than the parents, but the parents were at a disadvantage socially, because they weren't able to survive other than learning some English. So generally, the educational policies that are happening now have really deprofessionalized teachers. It's also demoralized them, because they're actually working within such a narrow curriculum. And the students said to me, there's no value added in education anymore. When I did my first degree, which was my undergraduate political and economic degree, we had a dynamic lecturer who taught us about Marxism. We did all the breakdown of the USSR and the economies. We did all of that. We did the Bay of Pigs. We did about the political economy in Cuba. It was very dynamic. And then you had the scope to develop your mindset and actually be introduced to things that you've never learned before. I think that's gone out of education now. There's no scope. And students themselves, they just need qualifications so that they can go on and earn money. And they themselves often, they don't want if you did put in the value added as part of the hidden curriculum, as in Ivan Illich, that would be you as an individual tutor, but there would not be any support from your colleagues, because that's not what you're there for. You're there to just teach the curriculum and take your wages. So to me, the students have been de-skilled, and the tutors have been deprofessionalized and de-skilled with these current education policies. And I think it's going to get a lot worse before it actually gets better. And I train teachers. I'm a teacher educator. So I'm in despair when I'm training teachers to teach students. And I find that I'm restricted in how far I can develop them. Whereas previously, before 1992, before the Further Education Act, you could actually teach additional skills or soft skills to teachers in training. Simple things like writing on the board or voice projection and other things, and teaching them about economics or politics of the countries of the students that they will be training. But that is all being stripped now. So you have the knowledge, but you have to restrict what you can deliver. And I find that it's very disempowering, it's deprofessionalizing, and it's de-skilling teachers.
Thanks so much.
The students suffer. At the end of the day, it's the students that suffer. And a lot of people have left the profession since 1992 because of the suite of policies. Lots of colleagues have left the profession and just gone to manual jobs because they said at least they can see what they're doing and they're not fooling themselves. They feel like they're defrauding the students under the current system. And that's all I have to say.
It's a real illustration, isn't it, of what we've lost and what we have to fight for. And we've got a little bit, like 8.5, 9 minutes left. And what I'm going to try and do is to bring us back round to how organising in the workforce could be a way of kind of activating education, kind of taking education into other spaces. So we know that coronavirus has obviously exposed enormous injustices at work, and perhaps one of the most topical recent examples is the unmasking of what's been going on in Leicester with the garment factory sweatshop situation there, the hugely disproportionate impact on immigrant women, and this kind of all in the name of unsustainable quick fashion, cheap fashion kind of stuff. We're talking about the increasing sort of prevalence of workforces without the adequate protection, without trade union strength there. So many dangers, so many that this has really highlighted. I'd like to ask you, and I'm going to have to ask you to do it in like 2 minutes or less, to each comment on how do you think education and activism can help us in challenging this and to kind of bring that workforce organisation to the fore. So I guess it's about how do we use education to do workplace organising, and how do we use workplace organising to inform education? So I'm going to start with Dalia, if that's okay, and yeah, just try and do a quick version of that, and then we'll finish on time. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that particularly those of us who are, doing the kind of precarious work of education right now, and as Charmaine was talking about, kind of the deprofessionalizing of being an educator, has massive. It's this thing of trying to squeeze every last pip out of your graduate teaching assistants and your fractional staff who are upholding the entire teaching infrastructure, essentially, of universities, squeezing every last pip, which leaves them with very little space to do any critical work, which does not consider them as human beings with families and social lives, etc. And I see an increasing amount of crossover between the changing norms of work in the sectors that I'm looking at, like domestic work and gig and platform and mini cab work, and the way that my work is being structured as a GTA. So things like the emphasis on ratings as a way, getting people to rate you, and your job resting on whether or not you're rated well or poorly. And we know that affects like women of color educators more than anyone else. The denigration of the fact that we're not seen as workers, we're seen as people who are doing passion projects, and therefore we don't have access to workers' rights and pensions and things, and adequate sick leave. But I also think that another way that this is so the material structure of the university, who is recruited to do what kind of work, and also, and not just academic staff, but non-academic staff as well, means that the material structures and the working conditions of the people who work in the university is integral to getting the kind of educational changes that we want. But also, I think it's really critical to talk about the assault on basically the rising power of the far right in universities, and the fact that universities are being used as a site of struggle by the far right, with all of this stuff about, lists of left-wing academics, of, framing the issue of free speech and stuff as something to simply weaponize against people of color and anti-racist educators, when really, when we're talking about free speech and the suppression of knowledge production, it's really about the people who have been sidelined and marginalized from the education historically, that we never talk about it in those terms. And, when we saw this from the Rhodes Must Fall movement, when a couple of students tried to contest the infrastructure of the university, and we had our own chancellor of the university calling up radio stations telling us that we should go to China if we hate free speech so much. So, who's the snowflake here, really? So I think that pillar, those pillar of the material working conditions of people who comprise the university, academic and non-academic staff, and being wary of how the far right is understanding the university is an incredibly important site of power, and we have to approach it in a similar way, as Anne Pettifor pointed out earlier today.
Thanks so much. We are running short of time, but I'd just like to try and get a comment from each of the rest of the panel on this, if it's possible. So Anne, your name was just taken, so could we come to you next?
Just quickly to say, look, the big struggle that we're now engaged in, and that we have to engage in, is to strengthen labor versus capital, not just here, but in the world, right? That imbalance between labor and capital is now obscene, that inequality. So trade unionism, organizing, labor movement organizing, we've got to make it sexy again. We've got to make it vital again. We've got to make sure everybody gets involved in that. Only when we build our own collective organizations and build the power that's associated with us all working together within unions, only then can we begin to challenge this. So for me, it's the trade unions, it's the trade unions, it's the trade union movement. And that has to apply in particular to Leicester, right? Why aren't those women organized? Can I just say before we stop again quickly, things do change. And I'm just looking at this panel, which is a women-only panel. And I'm thinking 20 years ago, this wouldn't have been happening, right? So we've done well so far, girls. There's a long way to go. Next time, it ought to be all black. But let's face it, this is progress. And I'm pleased about it.
Thanks so much, Anne. I'm going to come quickly over to Charmaine as well for your comments on this, and then we'll go to Grace and we'll finish up and hand over. So Charmaine?
Right, I'm just echoing what Anne's just said, but I just want to really emphasize that being unionized and being more political is the key to education empowerment and activism. And I think it's not as Anne says, it's not as sexy now, but it needs to re-engage. And we need to have students and everybody being more politically aware and politically active. In other words, being engaged in unions so they can have their voice heard and have the support of colleagues who are in those same unions.
Thanks so much. And Grace, can I come to you next as well on the same issue?
Yeah, so I mean, one of the biggest challenges we face is that lots of young people just barely even know what a union is, right? It conjures up like images of old white miners covered in soot or whatever is the prevailing representation of unionism in the mainstream media. So that's a big challenge. And even if they do know what they are, they think, why on earth could a union benefit me? I'm here to compete. I'm in the jobs market to, elbow my competition out of the way. Why would I band together with other people in order to demand more from my employer? And in order to kind of generate that understanding that upon which kind of a solid labour movement can be built, you need to have an understanding that classes exist, as Anne was saying, that labour and capital have different interests, how those classes are composed, and learn that by only banding together and organising can we ever really achieve any kind of change, not just an improvement in working conditions, any kind of change whatsoever. And that's extremely hard when you're talking about already marginalized communities. And some of that is on unions themselves needing to be dynamic, responding to conditions on the ground, not some kind of idealized version of what work was like in the past. But actually, a lot of unions have really adapted to this changing context and use the process of organizing as a tool for education. UCU has been one of those unions, and it's been amazing to see the political education that has been taking place on the picket line. That has made the experience of organizing not just a series of endless, boring meetings with management, but actually a process of political education and class formation. And that's so, so exciting. And I know that there are other unions. Dave Ward, who's about to come on in a second, has done some amazing work with posties in the CWU. So it's great to kind of see the labour movement itself actually changing and adapting to our times. What is really important now is just kind of, giving young people an awareness that unions exist and that they're there for them.
Thanks so much. And on that note, I think we're going to come to the end of our section, but just to say that what we've really been emphasising is the importance of opening up education, opening up our unions and listening to each other and working together. That's been an incredible panel. Thank you so much to all of you. And I hope you can stick around for the rest of this amazing event we've got on for the rest of this evening. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Hello. That was, I'm sure everyone will agree that that was absolutely amazing. I've been watching for the last 50 minutes, making my own comments on Facebook and sort of like whooping along to pretty much everything everybody was saying. So Dave, hi, how are you doing?
Hi, Joe. Yeah, not too bad. Yeah, I was interested in the comments in the last 10 minutes. You clearly had a great session there. So I learned quite a bit in that 10 minutes, believe me. Did you? Good. Well, we can get onto that in a second. But before we begin, two things I wanted to say to you. One, happy birthday. It was Dave's birthday on Sunday. Yeah. And also our Ruby wedding anniversary, 40 years married. On your birthday? On the same day, yeah. So you never forget it? Never forget. That was what. I've managed to do that on occasions. I'm also going to give you some airtime. Oh, yeah. Would you like to explain and give a little plug if anybody wants to get one? Yeah, so that's the CWU's football shirt as part of our anti-racist campaigning. And one of the things that we focused on is having the debate with our members. And obviously, we understand the power of sport. So we hooked up with Show Racism, the Red Card. But we had a great session online a couple of weeks back where we went live to our members, and the whole debate was about why it's important that unions don't outsource our anti-racist campaigning work. Yeah. And the football shirt, we've put it on sale as well, and it's really going well. So we're encouraging our branches to buy versions of the football shirt with our anti-racist campaigning messages on it, to take it into their local communities as well. Our branches who have an interest in sport in their local community, to take it to teams. Doesn't have to be just football, can be any sport in that sense. So yeah, no, we're pleased about that. It's another example, I suppose. We've got a great team at the CWU of people who are innovating in how we use our digital platforms, in how we communicate and engage with our members. So we thought it was really important to have that session. I felt for some time, Joe, that unions have a responsibility to lead in this area. Yeah. And the best place to take that debate is right into the heart of the workplace. And that's what we've been doing. No, and you had a photo wearing the shirt as well, which went down well. I did. It's kind of like semi-Sheffield United colours, which is problematic for me as an owl. But out of solidarity, I did it anyway. All right. I can live with that. So I just wanted to pick up on some of the amazing contributions in the back end of the session that we've just had and kind of explore some of them with you. Yeah. But before we did, one of the things we're asking everybody this evening is to talk through, and there were some great examples in the discussion that was just had, of a really important educational experience that has somehow kind of shaped your life or has sort of changed the way you think about something. And it doesn't have to be a classroom-based experience, though it might be. And I was just wondering, just wanted a flavour of what might have formed you. I would say that mine was more of that generation. It was a bit of a rebellious moment. Let me share with you one story that is quite funny but true. When I left primary school and you had to be interviewed for your secondary school, I got interviewed by a Jesuit monk at the time who asked me the question to get in. One of the questions they were asking about getting in the school was, what did I read? And out of the blue, I said, Charles Dickens. And I'd never read a book by Charles Dickens at that time. I'd read plenty of Enid Blyton books. And basically, this guy took me through, led me a bit of a merry dance, and then exposed the reality that I'd never read Charles Dickens by saying, "You've never read Charles Dickens, have you?" And I went, "No." And he went, "Interview over," and that was the end of it. So, no, look, what shaped my experience is more not what I've done in that sense, because I did have a few sort of moments in my educational life, but I would say two of my daughters, really proud that both of them went to university later in life. Both got honours degrees, and one became a teacher. She's a teacher in Glasgow, so she talks to me a lot about the pressures that teachers face and the intensification of work. And the other became a midwife. And I suppose, I realised and encouraged them to take part in that educational part of their life, and that it was never too late. The other thing that was great for me, that did happen a couple of years back, or it seems a couple of years back, was that I was asked to co-chair Labour's Lifelong Learning Commission. And, I saw firsthand there some of the problems that exist in higher education, further education. And I saw also the passion of people who wanted to get it right. And to be part of that, and to be part of something that produced a really, what I think was an outstanding report by the people. I had the easy job of just chairing the meetings, really, and keeping driving it forward. But it was a really important piece of work. And it showed me the importance of collaboration amongst all the various parts of the teaching world, the providers, the learners, the trainers. And from listening to all of those that participated on the panel, it showed me as well how big the problems were of marketisation within our educational services. So it was great to be part of something that talked about resurrecting universal education for all. And it had a plan sat behind it. It brought people together. It resurrected some of the education and maintenance grants that needed to be there. It resurrected the right to pay time off work. And another area that I was particularly interested in was how union learning reps could actually play a wider role in delivering that entitlement for society. So it's something that we're keen to continue to pursue. Labour obviously suffered a devastating defeat, but I've watched your campaign, Joe, Funding the Future, and the various points that you guys are putting forward. It's a campaign the whole movement needs to get behind, and we certainly will.
Thanks, Dave. And I think what you say about, your involvement with that lifelong learning report, but also, your daughters choosing to enter sort of higher education as adults is really key. And I think one of the things that we're trying to do with this campaign, and one of the reasons, we've got UCU members on these panels this evening, with other speakers, is there is, in some communities, a real myth that higher education, for example, is just elitist, that further education is just for sort of jobs. And though, people maybe don't even know about adult education because of the systematic cuts and underfunding of that sector. But as you're kind of like pointing out, even if it's just with your family members or the programs you've been involved with, like fully transformational, allow people second chances at education if for whatever reason when they were younger they didn't get it, or actually just to do something enriching. And this is really what we are doing with this campaign. And the polling that I don't think you were with us when I addressed it at the beginning, but we've had some polling that we're going to release tomorrow. And in university cities, 40% of those polled know somebody who works there.
Yeah.
You know, because it's not just people who teach, which is, you know, obviously the way in which people think about it. It's librarians, you know, it's people who work in the mental well-being unit. It's people who work in the various offices. You know, it's people who do the facilities and estates. But then in addition to that, those communities, I think the polling says about a third of people, their income somehow is dependent on those universities. So there's so much more than just, you know, a strict educational space. But one of the other things I wanted to chat with you about, and it was really interesting to hear it at the end of that panel, was, and I think, you know, your shirts are kind of part of this, is organisation as a tool for education. And Grace was talking about the amazing UCU picket lines that develop, and I don't know if you've heard of them, but we do teach outs when we do strikes and pickets in the UCU. And this sometimes will kind of literally happen on a picket line if the weather is nice, or at least dry. Or sometimes, you know, colleges and universities, you're able to get space where you can come inside and get a cup of tea and warm up. And one of the really nice things that happened during, there was a dispute at Nottingham College last year, and then obviously there was the HE disputes that happened this year and last year, is staff, I think, sometimes got to spend more time with their students actually on those picket lines, educating them about activism, educating them about politics. Dalia just then in the previous session was talking about the Roads Must Fall campaign that they were involved in. You know, in some senses, genuine education that's going to transform lives, and that you will look back on in 10, 20 years and say, yeah, I did that, and I was part of that. And I was part of that because we had all this space to think. And so frequently you don't have this space to think because you're driven by all the metrics that you have to do, all these kind of proxy ways of valuing us that we don't think value. And I was just wondering if you like want to reflect on what you do in the CWU, because I know you do loads, and kind of how that kind of interlinks, because I think that we see a lot of really interesting activism from your union members online too.
Yeah, I think that we see it as something that is a responsibility now to change the union, to engage with our members using every platform we possibly can. So even prior to COVID, you know, we would, as a union, have been developing ideas on how we get into our branches, how we encourage branches to set the right tone of engagement with their own members within their branch. So it's not something that the union nationally has to own. It's something that we set a standard for our regions and our branches to follow, and we encourage them to go as far as they can. The stuff you've been doing, Joe, UCU, in your disputes, and you've been, you know, a great union at the forefront of many of the disputes that the movement has seen in recent years. And I know it gets tough at times, and it seems, you know, that there's always a struggle to be had. That's the reality of our movement. And you guys have had your fair share over the last few years, and you're doing a great job. The rest of the movement watches that. So when you're talking about the connection that you made directly with students through those disputes, I thought that was a great thing. In a similar way, you know, what we try to do is encourage, for example, our learning reps. We've got an army of learning reps to be active in disputes as well, to be active in their local communities, to take our message of trade unionism out into some of these community groups that have sprung up since COVID. So collectivism and education and defeating inequality and defeating racism, all of these planks are all linked, if you like, through education. And, you know, I think we can learn as much from you guys as what you can learn from us. I suppose with us, you know, I sort of am a really strong supporter of workplace trade unionism. And for me, that was almost always the powerful moment. It's not when you're a general secretary of a trade union. When people ask me that question, I always remind them of the time I spent as a postal worker in the delivery office there, 12 or 13 years being a local rep. And when you get people behind you in those situations at the workplace, what you can achieve is phenomenal. Obviously, our job is to connect that, but we have to give the confidence to our representatives to be able to take those fights on. And you guys have been doing that. You've been giving confidence to students to understand what disputes are about. I remember when we shared platforms, you talked about that passionately, and it comes across, and it's clearly making a difference.
Yeah, and I think that confidence as well becomes really apparent, doesn't it? With when members, or like when a group of workers really take on the challenge to kind of fight back against something local and really self-organize and power map their own organization and really take control of what they want their campaign to look like, as opposed to expecting or wanting, an outsider to do it. And I think that's when you feel really proud, don't you, that something is changing and that, you're going to kind of push forward with an agenda. That's what I think has been really great to see, whether it's, the pictures that have come out of your depots. I don't know if that's what they are, when your members have been doing their campaigning, and it's obviously different, but I think it's similar to what we've seen in UCU, these kind of really powerful, strong, self-organized workers offering solidarity and helping out other groups of workers as well, and inspiring what we do.
It's very powerful stuff when you can get people to turn that combination of workplace meetings, of meeting face to face. I know there's restrictions on that at the moment, but you combine that with what's on offer through digital platforms. You get a sense of solidarity that I think has been missing in our movement for many, many years. There's some great opportunities in front of us, though, at the moment to organise workers. So I was really pleased last week with the TUC's pledge, all of the general secretaries, yourself included, me, and all the affiliates pledging for greater cooperation between unions to organise workers. And what has to be at the root of that is this organisation where possible. It's not always possible in every situation across the economy, because obviously there's a lot of people who don't work in workplaces, and we have to reach those people with digital platforms, and we're working on stuff on that at the moment. But it's when you get that coming together locally, and they take pride themselves in telling everybody else, this is what we've done in our area. And what we find is it's the right way to use competition, because it creates, our own version of internal competition, about the only version we can accept when each office is fighting to make sure that they've got more yes votes to support the union in an industrial action ballot than the other one. It's the only version of competition that I'm up for.
Yeah, a bit of healthy ballot competition is always good. We definitely see that in UCU. A lot of online banter, meme wars sometimes, or GIF wars definitely help drive up engagement. But I was wondering if you wanted to chat with me a little bit about what I think is a big challenge for us as trade unions, but whether we're organising a ballot or organising anything really. And I think that's the difference between kind of like mobilization and actually organizing, because I think one of the problems that we've had as a left movement, whether it's the trade union movement or not, is that sometimes the ability to mobilize people in any one moment, whether it's to get lots of people to an event or lots of people maybe to put their name on something, that's not necessarily the same as long-term organizing and actually organizing for power, and the real types of long-term networks you need to build and kind of education that you need to do, and the groups that you might need to reach out to as well. And I think that there's got to be a moment, hasn't there, amongst the trade union movement in the UK, of actually pausing and reflecting and figuring out which other groups they need to work with and what they need to do. And I think one of the things that I started when I began as General Secretary last year was what are we going to do with our training, with our reps training? How are we going to make sure that there's an organizing element in that reps training? So that when whatever your kind of workplace setup is, when someone new rocks up in your corridor, you can go and start talking to them about the trade union and why they should be in it, and why it's good, and actually in a way that's meaningful, rather than I'm giving you a flyer and that's an indicator that I've organized. And I was wondering what you thought about that, really, and what the CWU are doing, and the challenges that you think we face.
Well, let me confess that the CWU in that world is a really, really strong union. As a trade union, we can smash the anti-trade union law ballots because we've got terrific engagement with our members that's been built up over many years. I have a concern that our union can be a little bit insular at times, and that comes from the makeup of the CWU, which is predominantly a union that still goes back to what we call the old GPO, the General Post Office, where its membership is still based predominantly on telecommunications members and postal workers, and we want to expand that. We want to get into the world in our sectors where we can start recruiting, through digital campaigns and platforms, technical workers, for example, which have a nice fit for us in the world of communications. I think that the organising agenda has been kind of an agenda that goes through phases of where, we say this is the right thing to do. At the moment, my honest view is unless the movement does things and takes action, people are not going to join trade unions. I think that's the number one lesson that we all have to learn. And how we mobilise together to help each other, and how we make the connection between all of the struggles that we're all facing to do what Anne said, really, which was to address the imbalance, the structural imbalance between capital and labour. These are the fundamental questions, and you have to be up for taking the employer on, is the bottom line. Unless unions are going to start taking employers on collectively, and I think that's the real challenge we face. If we get that right, and our New Deal for Workers campaign, which CWU has championed for a long time now, we will get people joining trade unions, and the education that comes from that will multiply the amount of people who become part of the trade union movement. I'm not convinced personally that our existing structures as a movement are flexible enough to grab hold of the levels of membership that we now need to organise across the UK. So one of the things we're thinking about doing is not being as bureaucratic as trade unions have traditionally been. Our sort of people will hear me say a lot about the rule books of unions, and I'm a general secretary who's not that interested in the rules of the union. I'm interested in doing things. I'm interested in workers standing up for themselves as part of a collective. I'm interested in connecting with your union and the rest of the union movement in mobilising workers to fight for a new deal. These are our priorities going forward. So I think we need to think differently about our structures. I think we need to be less bureaucratic, and we need to be driven by what's happening at the grassroots. And there's some fantastic things, despite the fact that we're in a crisis at the moment, that must be giving us all hope. Some of these self-help groups that have come up. What's our role as a trade union with those groups in communities? You guys have got a great role within that, but so have we. I mentioned earlier on about our learning reps. So look, this is a moment to come together, and I think that's our key challenge. Is what's the agenda that's going to connect all of our individual struggles.
Somebody's just said they want more responsive, flexible training. I mean, I feel like some of us are a better advantage to do that than others, but Just wanted to respond to something you said, because I think for me, and I think we have a kind of a commonality here, how we connect to people who maybe will never be our members because then they don't work in our sector, right? So it's not like everything's always a recruitment, but are a fundamental part of the stakeholder kind of community group that we need to make sure are looked after. And, you know, if we think back to what Anne was just saying, that, you know, you can have ideals, you can organize, but you need political power as well. You need that. And, you know, we are up against it in the UK, but left globally, against, you know, right-wing politicians, against a right-wing media, against an economic system that is, you know, stacked against us, against several decades now of kind of neoliberal economic governance. And at that point, you know, there is a duty on us to think so much more broadly about what we are doing and who we are representing than just our members. And, you know, for a lot of people who are very embedded in, well, our members are our direct debits, and they, you know, they help the organization exist, and they eventually help us, you know, progress things in the workplace. There has to be that other element as well. And I think that what really appeals to me about the way in which, you know, you talk about working together and the New Deal is that we as general secretaries have to find a space of speaking to each other where we can identify how we do that. And I think, you know, to use the language of Jane McAlevey, there's no shortcuts. None of this is going to be easy. It's going to take a hell of a lot of graft. But if we want to fundamentally change the economic system to a system that, you know, one of the many things we just heard throughout that last session was how much education has been decimated, how many cuts there's been to adult educators, you know, the cuts that institutions will happily see now rather than fight with their workforce for a government bailout that would actually give everybody breathing space and education the time to kind of flourish. And nobody's going to do that for us. And we've got to figure out spaces that we can do that to support each other. And I think one of the things about this campaign, and I think one of the things that the CWU have done very well, is that after privatisation, you know, you guys didn't say, that's it now, you know, we are just workers for a private company. You know, you very much took control of that narrative and said, no, we provide a social function. We do all of these other things. And part of this campaign is not simply just about saying, oh, we need some money from the government, please. It's about genuinely reaching out to communities, reminding people what people who work in education do, whether that's research or teaching or any of the other types of functions that happen in education institutions that allow that to continue. It's about changing that narrative and reaching out. So I think, you know, we've been quite inspired, I think, by the ability of you to do that. And I think the idea that we need to find ways to keep working together to give each other energy sometimes when it actually gets difficult is really important.
Yeah, I agree with your analysis there. And I think that, you know, when I look at the movement at the moment, I think we've got some great activists in the movement. We've got some courageous people. What we haven't found is the way to connect it. And I think it was Charmaine that was speaking in the previous session. When I came in, I think I got the back end of what she was saying. And it's something that I agree with, is you've got to connect your industrial and political agendas. And for too long, the trade union movement has divided itself on these issues. You know, you hear people talk about, well, I'm an industrial rep, and somebody else says, well, I'm a political activist. Yeah. The answer is to connect both. And how you do that, for example, is, you know, we think about that a lot. You know, there's no point in us running an industrial campaign if we're not going to tell the members the reality of some of the political decisions that have brought us to this point. So you talk about, you know, us and privatisation. One of the things we did, I mean, that was a political decision in the end. Unfortunately, we tried everything possible to stop that vote taking place. But at that point in time, even the Labour Party were flirting with the idea and had proposed a model of privatisation because they said the industry was a basket case. So we took a decision that we would have a dispute. We got a massive yes vote. We weren't able to stop the political decision, but we put in place a load of restrictions on what might happen in the future. And that's still in place now because the union's strong enough to defend. So Royal Mail as a private company cannot, at the moment, introduce two-tier terms and conditions. It cannot franchise out parts of the business. It can't sell off the logistics side. We've signed them into agreements that we're strong enough to defend. But also, we did, when we had a CEO recently during COVID-19 who's now left, and I think our mini campaign certainly helped him on his way, was, they tried to undermine the universal service. And they tried to introduce changes that they wanted to make permanent during COVID-19 by quoting some of the problems with sick absence during that period. And we responded by calling for Postal Workers' Day, which we had once a year, but we basically made it up during the COVID-19. And
don't think you're supposed to let out that trade secret.
That's all right, yeah. Well, we did. We had 2 in 1 year. Let's put it like that. We normally have it around December, and we decided we would have it in April, and we got all the media interested in this. Was Postal Workers' Day. We offered up the service, our members working as an additional emergency service, helping the elderly, helping vulnerable people, and we shamed the company really into moving away from the position that it was trying to exploit. So yeah, there's some great examples, but working together, Joe, is what we're up for. Working together across the movement. I'm thinking about that all the time, as I know you are.
Well, I'm just going to end with something, because I think what you've just said about Royal Mail, and actually when workers push and are able to get victories and the confidence it gives them. We've had a comment in from Kitty, who was the Nottingham College brand secretary during their dispute last year, where the college basically wanted to obliterate kind of every term and condition that they have and make people sign new contracts. It was horrific what they were trying to do. And there was 15 days worth of strike action taken. And this is the comment from Kitty. The Nottingham College dispute relied on close organisation of increasingly empowered grassroots activists. Organisation empowers members towards mobilisation and the camaraderie and unity that was needed to sustain joyful militancy that won the dispute. UCU supported the strike through get the vote out resources, support of regional staff, visits from the union hierarchy, but also efficiency of delivering the strike pay, which was crucial, which is why at the beginning we asked if anybody wants to donate to the UCU Fighting Fund, you can do so by visiting our website, because that was, one of the things that was able to sustain that action. We have actually taken up more than our time.
I noticed that.
So, and we've got Billy Bragg and Janet Farrer, our president-elect, and I think Justin, one of the UCU members, to take part. So I think it's time for us to go, Dave. But thanks for
the warm-up act for Billy Bragg.
You were warm-up. What's your favourite Billy song?
Well, actually, I like one of his albums with Mark. Look, I can't remember the name of it, but it was a blues one he did. It'll come to me. You've got me now.
Was it Shine a Light, Dave?
No, not that, Billy. The one you did with Wilco.
Wilco, Mermaid Avenue.
Yeah, brilliant.
There we
nice
go.
One, mate. Thank you.
From that album.
Well, it's time for us to go. We're eating into the time where Billy's going to be talking about stuff. And we've had an amazing kind of initiative at UCU with Billy for guitars in prisons. So thanks for being with us.
Let me just show Billy my new birthday present there, new Telecaster.
Very tasty, Dave. Very nice. That one that's just beautiful.
Very nice.
Give us a tune.
Right, okay. Dave, pack it in. Look,
it's all over the place. Look.
Right, okay. Well, we're leaving, and it's going to join you. Bye.
See ya. Here we are, folks. Hi, Janet.
Billy.
For a moment there, I thought I was left to my own devices.
No, I just thought you could do a monologue. I thought you knew. Sorry.
Find a guitar. There's a mandolin on the wall behind me. I could have given.
Well, you could always fill, I suppose. Yeah, absolutely. So I was going for a serious tone. I think that's gone out the window. So welcome to Billy Bragg. I can't actually believe I'm chairing this session. My name is Janet Farrer. I'm President-elect of UCU. And I chair the Further Education Committee, which has representatives from adult education, further education, and of course prison education. So just a little bit of background before we start off. We are waiting for Justin, but hopefully he'll pop up in a minute. He'll be very welcome when he does. So I work in FE College. I teach trade union education, so I train trade union reps for a living, which is pretty much living the dream. And at the minute, I'm actually teaching some prison educators, prison education reps, on a course to expand their branches. So I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. So obviously we are absolutely overjoyed to be joined by Billy Bragg. And, you know, I'm a little bit flustered, as you can tell, but I am waiting for Justin as well. And I'll give him his introduction. When Justin does come, we're going to be delighted to be joined by Justin Borland, who's a prison educator who teaches music. And it's featured in our From the Future video, so that is true fame right there for Justin. So I want to talk a little bit about, obviously I'm going to bring these guys in to talk about how music can empower and educate and have a massive impact on people in prisons and on the whole community actually, and on society as well, and how it can change lives. But I'd like to just talk briefly about why it's so important to me. So as I mentioned, I'm teaching a group of prison education reps at the minute, and you know what struck me most in their introductions to the course was just that they were all so humble. And it was all, I'm just a health and safety rep and I'm only a caseworker and this kind of stuff. And that kind of thing seeps into their professional lives as well. And, you know, let's be clear, what these people do is absolutely incredible in really, really tough conditions. And we had a really interesting discussion about whether or not prison education represents a second chance for learners, or whether or not it represents their last chance, or in some cases whether or not it represents a first chance. You know, and for people who've been disillusioned by their educational experiences before, you know, sometimes down to really simple things like dyslexia that's been undiagnosed and has caused them to kind of behave, you know, badly in the class, and then so goes their educational journey. So I think for me, what amazes me about prison education is how it builds people's confidence, and you know, it stretches people and it prepares them for returning home. And you know, the prison educators that I've been teaching just talk so proudly about their students and about how their confidence has grown. Oh, Justin, we're delighted to have you. Wonderful.
Hi, Justin.
Like I've just been filling.
Welcome.
Hi, ladies.
You're very, very welcome, Justin. Thank you very much for coming. So as I was just saying, you know, the pride with which these educators talk about their students and about, you know, how they can have really respectful attitudes and really kind of putting loads of hard work in and doing it, you know, for the teachers because someone's put faith in them for a change. Yeah. So I think it's such an important and overlooked sector, prison education. And of course, that's where these two come in. So Billy Bragg's Jail Guitar Doors project is the aim was, and obviously Billy will talk a lot more detail about it, looking to provide instruments for those who are using music as a way of rehabilitation in prisons. And of course, this fits in with UCU's view that education is a lot more than just a grade on a piece of paper. And that's where we're coming from. The idea that the power of creativity and how it can benefit mental health and well-being, I think, is a really interesting element. So without further ado, I will shut up. I'll hand over to the real experts, to Justin Borland and of course to Billy Bragg. And I'd just like to start, if you could both say briefly a few words, it's the theme of tonight, about your most significant or important learning experience. So that's for you personally, whether that was in the classroom or otherwise. So if it's not throwing you into the lion's den, Justin, do you fancy going first, and then I'll hand over to Billy?
Oh yeah, definitely. Good evening to everybody. I'm a big fan of Billy's as well. So for everybody, it's really glad to be here. Thanks for inviting me. Right, there's been a lot of
Is that your gold record on the wall? Is that your gold record behind you on the wall there, Justin?
Yeah, I used to do a bit. I'm the first British rapper to be signed. So I was back in the days I would bomb the bass and beat Masters and S Express and stuff like that. And my uncle Smiley Culture, you would have heard of him.
Yeah, of course.
He's my mum's brother. So yeah, that's another story.
Right.
Well, I will use that actually. My late uncle Smiley Culture and my experience with education, because it was as a consequence of his untimely passing that I decided to study law. I went to South London, South Bank University as a mature student, 40 plus, and decided I wanted to study law because I was really aggrieved with my experiences with the justice system, criminal justice system in this particular occasion. So I studied law, and as I began to understand a few more things, I knew that the heart of me really loved music, and I wanted to find a way that I could engage young people, disenfranchised, often at risk, through the therapeutic medium of music. So I actually went back. I wanted to be a solicitor and barrister and all that. But as a consequence of the experience of my uncle's passing, I reached to education to empower myself and ended back really working with the people that I always really wanted to work with, and that's young people, and doing the thing that I always wanted to do, which was music.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much. You made a bang when you came in there, Justin. Brilliant. Billy, please tell us about your most significant educational experience.
My educational experience was a visit to the Ford Motor Company with my school. I grew up in Barking in East London, where when I'm old enough to have failed my 11 plus. So I was at a secondary modern school, being educated really to work for the car company or one of their ancillary firms. And we went to the car factory once a term to sort of look at what the jobs were like. And when I said I didn't want to work for the car factory, they told me I had one of three options then, which was the Army, the Navy, or the Air Force. And they gave me the forms. And I realized then I was going to have to sort of find a way out of this situation. So I started leaning heavily on my creative sources at school, those teachers that were encouraging self-expression, playing music, writing stories, putting together film and stuff like that, and realized that that was my way out. I really didn't want to be someone working at the car factory. So in the end, it was, I left school when I was 16. I didn't go into further education. But it was those years at school gave me the creative space, knocking around with friends, talking to teachers who were into Bob Dylan and stuff like that. I didn't have any older siblings to give me that link. And so it kind of came that way. It wasn't actually the formal education aspect of it. It was the space that they gave us at school to explore our creative side.
That's brilliant. Thanks so much. And there's not enough of playing in the sandpit, if I can use that metaphor, I think, at the minute.
That. Playing with guitars in the sandpit kind of metaphor would be a better one. But yeah, it was exactly that.
Absolutely. Okay, brilliant stuff. Thanks both for that. So if we can start with you, Justin, then, if you could just tell us about, why be a teacher in prison? What was the attraction for you, and can you talk a little bit about what you find rewarding, perhaps?
Right. I'll be frank and forthright. At 16 years old, I was sent to prison for 3 months, and I was actually in Felton, where I teach now. And I think when I finished my educational journey, I was working and mentoring and teaching and doing loads of music stuff as a producer. But I'd always been kind of trying to empower the local youth in the community and providing them free studio time and just mentoring and being an uncle to them wherever possible. So I think it was at that point, really, when I went to prison, that I felt that music was a way out, like Billy said, for me. I had a top 10 in the chart. So when I came, they let me out to do Top of the Pops, as I said. And I realized a lot of the young people that were in there, and I had a fantastic family structure. So a lot of the young people that have none of that, they have nothing to look forward to coming out. But a lot of them have tremendous amounts of talent and potential. And I think it's up to us as teachers to cultivate that talent. It's also, I should add, music's very therapeutic. So you don't have to be the next, whoever your artist is, whoever you like. You don't have to be the next big star.
Ed Sheeran, I think. Ed Sheeran is what we promised them.
Sorry.
Ed Sheeran, yeah.
Yeah, you don't have to be the next Ed Sheeran or Adele, for that matter, to reap the rewards of engaging in the creative writing process. So for my students, I've seen the change on them. Sometimes they just want to, sometimes it's self-expression. Sometimes it's a cry out from the dark. Sometimes they just, the benefits of music in Feltham that I've experienced firsthand are nothing short of amazing. And I'm sure Billy would echo that.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, really, it's a very simple equation for me for the work that I do. You mentioned at the beginning, Janet, that for the people in prison, whether it was their last chance or their first chance or whatever, it's actually our chance as citizens, because people are sent to prison as punishment. They're not sent to prison to be punished. And while they're in prison, while they're in our custody, we have the opportunity, we have the chance to help them to turn their lives around and not come back again. And there's a number of ways that you can do that. And one of them is to help them to build self-confidence. And with Jail Guitar Doors, what we're trying to do is give people the self-confidence that comes from self-expression, from having access to a musical instrument, if you can already play it, or learning to play a musical instrument. On the grounds that when people come out of prison, low self-esteem plays a large role in reoffending. To come out of prison with a skill that is a social skill, and playing a musical instrument is more of a social skill than a vocational skill. To come out of prison and go back into your community with that skill, to be able to articulate things that perhaps you're not able to say to your family and friends, I love you, but I've done a terrible wrong thing here and I want to make it up to you. To be able to say that in a song is in some ways more accessible to people, because there's something about being able to put it into music rather than words. Whether you're writing the song yourself or finding a song that's already been written that you can play, that you can embody, that you can use to put across your idea. Education plays a real key role in that. I mean, it's true what Justin was saying about therapy, because we're finding with the guitars that we send to prison now, over the last 5 years, I'd say we're more often finding it's the health department who are interested in the guitar. So clearly they understand the therapeutic side of it. But as a musician, I know that playing a musical instrument has the ability to help you to momentarily transcend your surroundings. When my son used to come home from school, he had a bad day, he'd go upstairs, plug in his electric guitar and play Ramones songs. And it was his way of dealing with the day. And when he was doing that, he wasn't in his parents' upstairs front bedroom in Dorset. He was at CBGB's with the Ramones. He was seeing himself in another place. He was transcending not only the environment, but the day, the mood, the feeling. He was accessing something else. And I've seen firsthand how inmates in prison recognize that someone who has access to playing a guitar is getting something that they can't get. They're getting some kind of access to some sort of redemptive force that is not available. You can't get it online. You can't get it, swapping cigarettes for it. There's something there. So it's that aspect of it, that therapeutic aspect of it, that is absolutely crucial. And, I never really thought before I started doing the Jail Guitar Doors initiative, and it is an initiative, not a charity. We're trying to find people who do the work rather than doing it ourselves. I never really thought how I use music as therapy, how I try to deal with the problems that I face by writing about them, by finding another way to articulate what it is that I'm feeling, and the joy and the satisfaction that I get from being able to do that, and how my peers look at me differently when I'm able to do that. All these things I kind of took for granted before, but working in prisons has made me realize how important that side of playing a musical instrument is, and it is possible for the introduction of musical instruments to change the mood in a prison. You know, and that's something that's really crucial. Now, the ministry are not always fond of it. Sometimes the peak caps don't like it, but those people who are working in soft rehabilitation with inmates, I think they find the common space that they make in teaching someone to play the guitar is a really, really valuable asset in engaging those people in the process of rehabilitation. And what Jail Guitar Doors tries to do is to give those people who are already working in the prison, doing that work, to facilitate them by providing musical instruments for them.
That's brilliant. Thanks so much. I just wanted to, if I can bring Justin in as well, for those who don't know, you know, the way that prison education works is obviously prison educators work for a prison, you know, an education provider, but then there's a kind of two-tier system, because obviously you've got the governor and the wardens and the people who are employed by the prison, and then you've got people that work for a different provider that kind of come in as outsiders. So do you find, Justin, that's a kind of barrier to what you try and achieve, what you know, in this project that Billy's just kind of like laying out?
Well, Billy's project, his initiative sounds fantastic. I've contracted at Felton, but I also run my own CIC, and we provide employment and careers programs for ex-offenders on release 6 months, 3 months before we're looking to pursue a career in the music industry. Not so much, they're more usually music producers and songwriters and usually rappers. That's just their orientation. But I still look at the voice as a musical instrument, so I concur with everything that Billy said. He said quite a few interesting things. One point I will touch on, and I've had some real conflict at Felton with this, is they censor what these young men are allowed to say to such an extent that the creative process has been, it's compromised. I can't really engage in it properly with them. Some of these young men, we should just try and understand a little bit of perspective. They come from very troubled backgrounds. The peer pressure in that classroom is very high. They often have SEN needs, cognitive challenges, sometimes all kinds of things. And what I was told by senior staff was any young man who, on his first performance on the mic, sometimes it takes them 2 or 3 months to muster the courage to do it. If they say anything wrong, if they breach the lines, or if they swear by accident or anything, stop the session, fling them off the mic. And I took umbrage with that. I had great problem with that, because it's no longer an educational process, it's a disciplinary one. And that's not what I'm there for. What I prefer to do is let them express themselves. If it is too much, I explain to them why, where we may be able to amend or edit that, and where the parts in their work might be offensive. And that's where I see the conflict between us as teachers and educators and that role of security, and some of their policies. They go directly against educating and allowing these guys any creative freedom.
Yeah. I mean, I've found in my experience that the only way you can get access is if you go with the grain in prisons. You know, and in some prisons, it's, you know, I meet the governor when I'm delivering the guitars. Other times I don't, and I get a very frosty reception from the peak caps. But there's been some places, particularly in youth young offender institutes, where the peak caps have been in charge of the teaching of guitar. And I know in them kind of places it's really going to stick. It's going to work. But the problem is, one of the big problems is, people probably aren't aware of this, is that inmates aren't allowed access to the internet. So if you're sending in software to make beats and stuff like that, it's very, very difficult for them. That's why we start with the guitar, because the guitar is a very basic instrument. And people say to me things like, why don't you do ukuleles or something, you know, like that. I think the thing about the guitar is that it's relatively easy to learn the first 3 chords to play. And most people can imagine themselves playing a guitar. It has that place in our culture where most people can imagine. They might not be able to imagine themselves playing the piano or playing the bassoon or something, but the guitar has a really crucial place in our culture. although I come from a slightly different culture to what's in prisons at the moment, the initiative's called Jail Guitar Doors because it was inspired by The Clash. It's a Clash B-side, Jail Guitar Doors. And I wanted to do something at the 5th anniversary of the death of Joe Strummer in 2007. I was looking for something concrete to do rather than just getting together with a load of 40-year-olds and playing old Clash songs, which we've been doing for the previous 5 years. And I met someone at a local prison who asked me if I had some guitars. I think he thought because I was a rock star, I had a load of spare guitars. I didn't, but I found some guitars for him. He was a drug and alcohol rehabilitation worker. And he was doing great work. And it kind of grew from that through connections that he had. But the key aspect of it is that it doesn't fit easily into a prison system that's looking to punish and find vocational things for people to do. It doesn't really fit in that. It's not. You can't promise that everybody who comes out is going to have a job in the music industry. It's a much more of a therapeutic thing, you know. But it allows people to connect with one another in a significant way, that in the intense atmosphere within a prison, introducing a musical instrument, having someone on the wing who can play a few songs, who's willing to teach a couple of other inmates how to play, these kind of things, you know, I've found it's been a real game changer. And in regards, if I may say, just in regards to prison education, perhaps the most significant thing anyone ever said to me in prison was in Wormwood Scrubs, where a prison officer who was sort of taking us out said to me, you know, this is all really great what you're doing, Billy, and I really appreciate it, but if we just could teach these guys how to read and write and make that, you know, an issue for probation, to enforce them to take those skills on. He said we can make a real significant difference to reoffending. And I think that's when I realized the importance of education in prisons. And he wasn't talking about a prison with a lot of people for whom English wasn't their first language. He was talking about, you know, young Britons who had got through the education system without getting the basic skills. So I think education is absolutely, absolutely crucial in prisons.
Absolutely, and we can see why you know, this joint project, you know, ECU coming in as a joint project is so important for those reasons that you've just said. Justin, is there anything that you want to add there?
No, there's a racial issue, unfortunately, that I thought I should raise, and that's a disregard for. We're talking about these young men that I teach at Feltham. They often rap. And the disregard for the ebonics, the language we use, the culture, black language. I've been, what we've been called inappropriate language is just the way that these young men speak. And it's often misconstrued. And it's a big problem actually, because I'm currently as I said, I'm actually having a big discussion with senior management about it. It's gone very high. And it's unfortunate in this climate of heightened racial sensitivity. I think they should be addressing this and allowing, you know, an understanding that everybody expresses themselves differently, and that if you don't understand something, maybe try to understand rather than condemning it.
I'd like to just pick up on that issue about language. I was in Wandsworth prison talking about guitars once. A load of inmates troped in. There was a huge guy, a massive guy, had sort of muscles on his muscles and a singlet, and he was staring at me intently all the time I was talking. When I was playing the guitar, he was staring at me with an intensity that was, frankly, it was a bit intimidating, I'll be honest with you. And when I finished saying my bit and it was possible to socialize with the inmates, he came directly over to me in a very gentle manner. He just reached out for the guitar, gave him the guitar, and he sat down and he began playing a kind of sort of almost like a gypsy type guitar. And a guy was talking, he didn't speak English, this guy, he didn't speak English. And a guy was talking to him, and who did speak English, and the guy who was speaking to him was Bulgarian. I said, oh, is he Bulgarian, Aldin? He said, no, he's Roma. He's a gypsy, like me, and I am as well, and that's why we can talk to each other. And I realized that in his culture, a guitar is almost a sacred object. You know, and I realized then the potential to overcome the racial barrier within our prisons, to help people to connect on a musical level rather than other aspects of connecting culture. Because this guy had obviously, he had a real skill in playing the guitar, and the idea that there was going to be guitars in the prison, that's why he was looking at me so intently. And I really came to appreciate that the way that music does something that language alone can't.
Yeah.
On that incredibly poignant note, I think we'll probably draw it to a close there. I just, I can't thank you both enough, really. I could listen to you both all night. I'm sure there'll be lots of UCU members watching who aren't involved in prison education, and maybe make them think about their own context. It definitely makes me think about mine. And hopefully we're getting, starting to change the tone of how we speak about prison education, and the power of music in prison. So it's a fantastic project. Thank you both so much for that. I should mention, because I'll get told off if I don't, and it's dead important. For UCU members, there's going to be a webinar dedicated to prison education on the 11th of August. So please do get yourselves registered for that. That's going to be great, and then we can carry on this conversation. So again, thank you so much, and I'm going to hand back over to our General Secretary, Joe Grady.
Billy, I'll pop you an email, mate.
Thank you. Look forward to hearing from you. All the best, Justin.
Thank you.
Thanks. Cheers.
That's a fine lady. Thank you, Bolchi.
Yes, Rebecca. Thank you, Rebecca. Much appreciated.
Cheers.
Wow, that was really, really amazing. I knew that Justin and Billy in conversation together would be really good, but I think to actually hear two people that are involved in that kind of initiative together was really powerful. If lockdown hadn't have happened, we would have been announcing that initiative at our Congress this year. Obviously that hasn't happened, but if that's something that you feel as a UCU member you have the skills to be involved in, we were going to be inviting people to kind of volunteer. So please do kind of get in touch with your region, or you can email me via our website on UCU if you want to be involved, because I thought that was a really good discussion and a really corrective in terms of actually the power of education and musical education in prisons. So we all, we're here. So this is the final session of this evening, and I'm back chairing, but I have been joined by some amazing guests. So just as a way of introduction before we get the session underway, I'm sure you already recognise the people that are here, but I will introduce them anyway. So we have Faiza Shaheen, who you probably know because she is the director of CLASS, which is the Centre for Labour Market. It's been a long evening. The Centre for Labour and Social Studies. And we have Sonia Adesara. Sonia is a medical doctor and activist who specialises in reproductive health. You probably also know her from being a campaigner for migrant rights, gender equality, and the Labour Party. And we also have Gary Young with us, who you may know from numerous amazing columns for The Guardian and many other outlets, and recently appointed a professor of sociology at Manchester University. So congratulations for that as well. So what I was hoping we could do in this final session is really talk about, so the theme of this evening is empower and educate. We are really trying to shift the narrative about what education does in our society, in our communities, not just our economy, which is the way in which lots of other people like to value it, and what it can and should do. From my perspective, education develops people's capacities. We were just hearing about that. It challenges them. It communicates values. It creates lifelong opportunities. It should and could be a source of dignity and community. And we've been hearing this evening, the system that those of us who work within education, and I think there are a lot of parallels here to healthcare, it's been turned into a dysfunctional consumer market. And often the people who work within it as a cost to be minimised, and students viewed as kind of, units of production that we need to get labour market ready. but education isn't a product. And what I'm really hoping is that we can really chat about who we think the current system is built for, but how we can maximize it and change that, and create a working environment that's healthy for staff, but also where students can flourish. However, before we get going, one of the things that we've been doing this evening is asking everybody to just kind of briefly introduce us to what you think in your life has been a really important educational moment. And if you were hearing the last session, you know, for Billy, it was visiting a car factory and being like, I'm not doing this. For other people, it was being, you know, in a particular context when they were studying. So I was just wondering if we could, if you would just sort of spend a minute or two, and it doesn't have to be classroom based, it can be something else. So Sonia, can we start with you?
History class was when I think started to actually wake up to the world. And I remember a few different things. I remember learning about the suffragettes, and that sort of created a fire within me. And I remember learning about the NHS, and actually that was what made me want to be a doctor. And because I wasn't actually very interested in science or medical science, but I think just learning about the NHS, learning what it did, and learning what society was like before the NHS was created was what made me feel like I really want to be part of that system. So yeah, I actually wanted to do history, but I was told that my English wasn't good enough to do it at university, so I went along the science route.
Oh, it's always nice to prove people wrong, isn't it? Yeah. Faiza?
Yeah, I just this is a funny one. I guess like what just immediately came to mind when thinking about this question was being about 8 or 9 years old, and someone had said something racist to me in the playground, and I'd gone to tell my teacher, and my teacher, she was a really lovely woman, but she didn't know how to handle it. And she started giving the classroom this kind of lecture about how dare someone say something racist to Faiza in the playground. I'm so jealous of her because she never has to worry about getting a suntan. And it really, I remember even at that age thinking, wait, that's not right. I don't think she was meant to say that. But you know, in terms of, I know it's a different type of learning experience, but it was really important to me because at that time, teachers weren't taught, even in the best, well-meaning way. And I had a lot of teachers that really believed in me. They didn't know how to deal with racism. And I remember in that moment thinking, I'm on my own and I'm going to have to talk to other kids in this class about why I'm here, why a Fijian Pakistani ends up in England, you know, and I just remember it being a real learning moment in life, discrepancy between what was said and what should have been said, and a realization when all the other kids were looking at me like, this is not helping.
Wow. And I think that's, yeah, I mean, I can imagine the extent to which that really sort of stays with you, as you say, the teacher in that space behaving that way. Gary, are you all right to share next?
Yeah, I couldn't do French at school, just the way the options worked out. So I ended up doing it at my local FE college. I had a very, I grew up under Caribbean matriarchy. So my mum's like, well, you know, you go do it over there. And I remember asking the teacher, Pierre, so how much do I have to do? You know, what do I have to do? Because he hadn't set any homework for the first couple of weeks. And he said, well, you can do nothing. You don't have to do anything. You don't have to be here. It's an evening school, you know. But anything you do, I'll mark. And this is, you know. And so I thought, I was 13 and I thought, oh, score, I don't have to do anything. So I spent the first kind of couple of weeks after that not doing anything. And then the penny dropped. They're like, well, what are you doing? Why are you here? And like, do you want to be good at French or not? And it was a real like thing about, well, you know, what do you want to do with this? And it was an ownership, a sense of ownership about my education. And I went on to study French and Russian at university. That was my degree, and I started, handing in bunches of work for him because I actually kind of wanted to be good at it. It wasn't for him; it was for me, and that was quite a revelation.
That's I think that's really powerful actually, when you can inspire students to want to do something because they want to do it. And I know that a lot of staff in education these days don't feel that they often have the opportunity to connect with students one-to-one like that. But I can't help but ask, did your mum find out you spent several weeks doing nothing?
No. No. I mean, she had, like many Caribbean matriarchs, she also had a couple of jobs. So she left it to me to kind of to figure out. And and I got there in the end.
Okay, so I think this idea of kind of ownership of your education is a really important one. And I was wondering if I could just maybe, you all have incredibly different, but I think really impressive political, professional, and activist communities. And we've heard a bit about, maybe what motivated you, Sonia, to pursue the career that you did. And I think, Gary, you just touched a bit, obviously, about how that FE experience maybe informed what you went on to study. I was wondering if you could all kind of reflect on and share what motivated you to move into the work that you now do, and if the motivation to keep doing it is any different or if it's changed. And I was wondering if maybe Faiza, I could come to you first this time.
Yeah, I mean, I think it probably started very early for me. So, yeah, we didn't have loads of money, but my dad was very intense about talking about racism and empire. So there wasn't a time that I didn't know about Malcolm X. My dad used to sit us down and make us watch these videos of like Muhammad Ali being interviewed, and he was very clear about the reason for us being here, and the importance for standing up for social justice. And I would see my dad get in fights with people, sometimes even physical fights, about these issues. So I think it kind of started quite early for us in that way. And so I think I was just always aware of the inequalities around me. And really, I guess the moment in which I really just kind of woke up to it all and how bad it was when I went from a local sixth form college or further education college in Walthamstow, Sir George Monarchs, and went to Oxford and just realised how privileged people were. I guess I just never seen it before. And just very clear that the people that I was surrounded by had this sense of manifest destiny to rule the world and, hold powerful positions and earn loads of money. And to be honest, seeing some of them drunk and hearing what they had to say when they were drunk, crazy stuff like, Faiza, tell us, why is it that Black people cause crime? Genuinely, I mean, I remember like just being so angry. And it was really, that kind of motivated me then I got a sense of how bad inequalities were. And inequality wasn't a subject that people were really looking into at that time. But I was sort of incensed by it, and I could feel it. I could feel it being in that crazy privileged Oxford libraries and, this beautiful old architecture, and then getting on the bus home and coming out in Walthamstow Central and getting sniffed by dogs to see if I had weed on me. I just felt it. And so that's really what motivated me then to go on and look more about what was happening on inequality and build off that life experience with an understanding of the trends and the statistics. And that's really just kind of carried on ever since. Yeah.
I think what you're saying about, those buildings at Oxbridge, and that manifest destiny, and if your parents went there and you visited there as a kid, and the idea that those buildings aren't inherently really intimidating to you, and as you say, a real kind of reminder of trying to reinforce what people's spaces in the world should be. I always think that whenever I go anywhere like that. But I was just wondering if what you were talking about, how that then manifested in obviously the campaign that you ran and the sort of policies that you wanted to see. I was wondering if maybe you could just take it a little bit further, if that's all right.
Yeah, of course. Sorry, I'm just like, don't want to take up too much time from the other speakers. Yeah, no, I mean, I think for me, I'm like running here in the constituency was in part about running against someone like Ian Duncan Smith and, you know, the man that lived in the mansion and the man with values that looks down on people like my mum, who was on benefits and was one of the people that was visited upon by these inspectors to see if she was lying about her heart failure. And it was really, for me, you know, it did feel very personal, and people don't like that sometimes, but, you know, it came from the heart for me. You know, I felt as if, you know, just going back to what my dad taught us as kids, that you have to stand up for what's right. And, you know, the opportunity came to run in the area in which I spent most of my childhood against someone that, you know, my family had personally been on the receiving end of their policy. So, you know, even if I talk about it now, it just kind of makes my heart feel funny. Like, it was just a very personal battle, but it was also something that spoke to a lot of people around the country and the amount of people that wrote to me. So that was why that battle occurred. And, you know, in all honesty, I'm still kind of trying to get over the trauma of losing against the man in the mansion, even though, of course, society has completely set me up to fail in that battle. And so, you know, I think there's an interesting discussion to be had there about the way in which social mobility maybe sells us a lie. But you know, for me, the think tank and class and the policies that we do is about structural change. And that was really the difference I felt when I first went into the think tank world, and people were like, a little bit of tax and change here and a little bit. And I was like, no, you know, I was surrounded by, let's face it, posh white people, and they didn't understand how bad things were. They felt like a little bit of a change here and there would do it. And I was like, no, because these things are systemic, and the system and the market system and the way in which racism is institutionalized is the problem. So, you know, lots of arguments with think tanks that I first worked in. And in the end, you know, just being able to be the director of class, where obviously with trade union support, we are able to just focus on the fact that it is structural and not waste time on sticky plaster policies that will ultimately change nothing.
Yeah, I completely agree with class, and we're so grateful that you're there and you do the work that you do, because it's exactly that. Gary, I was wondering if we could come to you about what motivated you to do the work you do and continues to do so.
Yeah, I mean, some of it is very similar to Pfizer. And I do think some of those, particularly when you're young and so not in control, some of those humiliations and microaggressions that your parents face are incredibly kind of formative, you know. And I just remember from a very early age having to be critical, having to have a critical understanding of where I was and what was going on. Why are these people shouting at me? Why are the people who are shouting at me today being kind of really good neighbors tomorrow? Why is this teacher ignoring me? Why are people saying I'm not from here? And why is there that map of Barbados on the wall? And why did you come here? Why do the papers keep lying about us? So I was kind of, from an early age, I remember there was a family just up the street that kept shouting abuse at us. And it got heavy, and my mum called the cops, and this was the first time I'd heard the term ethnic minority, because a policeman came and he said to my mum, well, you know, you're an ethnic minority and you're going to have to put up with this kind of thing. I grew up in Stevenage, outside London. And I said to my mum, what's an ethnic minority? And she said, well, he seems to think that means that people can do whatever they want and we just have to take it. And then she called the police station again and she said, I asked for a policeman, you sent me an idiot, you need to send me a policeman. And then a younger guy came, and he was, you know, he was a bit better, and he went and he talked to them. And so when you grow up around both that spirit of resistance and a kind of permanently critical eye. So nobody is above critique. And you'll see things on the TV about Ireland or the miners or whatever it is. And you're hearing a kind of parallel story to the one that is being told elsewhere. Then you kind of you develop a kind of very critical eye, which I then kind of could employ in my journalism. And there was another thing, and I do talk about my mum quite a lot because she was, she was quite a powerful figure in my childhood, and that she used to dance around with me on her feet to Young, Gifted and Black, and she'd say they're playing our song. And there was this sense that kind of like, look, the world you're fit for doesn't exist, so you're going to have to make it. She never said those words exactly, but the notion that anything was just there for you, just kind of, that was never a thing. So then you had to go out and you had to kind of, you had to make the world that you wanted to live in. And that also kind of informed my politics and gave me the kind of the confidence, along with my brush with the posh people like Faiza had. It wasn't until I met the posh people that I understood that I'd been to comprehensive. I just thought I'd gone to school. That's what they called it, where I was from. And I was like, they said, did you go to comprehensive? And I was like, I don't know. I don't know what that is. But it was a school. And they, and then they talked me through, did you have to take a test? Did your parents pay money? Oh, well, then you went to a comprehensive. So dealing with all of those people, they either, it's what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. So they either crush you and they crush your spirit, or you get through it and you realize they've got confidence. That's one of the things that you can buy with, with money, but they're no more intelligent and they're no more capable. And so it's that kind of blend of a certain kind of sort of self-motivated confidence and a kind of permanently critical eye on kind of everything, because that was how you were going to get through it, was by thinking, what's going on here? Do you know what I mean? Where's the power here, and how do I get out of this, and so on.
No, I think, well, I think you've turned that skill amazingly well in all of the professional work that you've done. But I think, what you're pointing out about, certain students that just have that inherent, almost entitled confidence. One of the challenges when you're teaching students, and particularly I think at higher education, where you've got those disparities between, comprehensive kids and others, is to really find them and nurture them. And then obviously that kind of disproportionately ends up falling to certain types of staff in the universities that can connect with those students. And then that's another, kind of burden that you've got to take on. Sonia, can I come to you? Because obviously I think, the motivation to do what you do must be huge. So I'd love to hear about it.
Actually, it's quite similar to, what I've heard Faiza and Gary talk about. Actually, particularly in relation to my mum, in that the injustices that my mum faced makes me angry, but also some of the opportunities that she was given, which has given like many of the privileges that I have, that I see are no longer given to people who look like her, also makes me angry. But I guess for me, my mum says that I was born, she says I was born red and angry. And I was always from quite a young age, I just would get angry at injustice. And I remember at one point she banned me from watching the news because I used to get so frustrated and I wouldn't be able to sleep at night at all the injustice that I saw in the world. But I guess as I'm speaking to educators, I think when I was thinking about in preparation for this and thinking about my university experience, I do feel like that side of me was suppressed. In that, in my university education, I don't think I was really, I guess I was being encouraged and rewarded to regurgitate information and to cram for exams and to conform, and I wasn't being encouraged to think critically and challenge what was being taught in medical school, and I think, I guess I feel like I haven't really started to learn properly until the last few years of my life. And I guess, I started working and I started, like we all do, see things that shouldn't be happening. I guess I saw people die and who shouldn't be dying, and I saw just, care, people being cared for in a way that I wouldn't want my mum or my grandma to be cared for. And I felt uncomfortable for the first couple of years. And then when I worked, I think, the real turning point for me was when I worked in a mental health hospital. And then I guess I was just so angry and upset at what I saw. And it sort of jolted me to start thinking, start asking questions. And I started to learn. And I guess I started to go to like talks like this and start to think about and understand actually what I was seeing. And things didn't have to just be like that. And actually, we needed to start asking questions and starting to be a bit more critical. And then I think once that started a process of me going more into activism in the health sector, but wider as well. And I think, I guess that's what I would sort of encourage thinking about university education, higher education. Are we really encouraging students to sort of think critically and challenge what's being taught? Because that was really missing from my medical education. I only sort of really started to learn to do in the past few years.
Yeah, completely. Sorry, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the sort of government phony war that I think is trying to be constructed right now. So I don't know if you've seen some of the comments in the last week or so, this sort of phony binary, I would say, between higher education and further education, and the idea that one has to come at the expense of another. And I was really wondering, given your varying different experiences with education, how you have been in FE or HE and how you felt within that. Just wondering if we could talk about who the current system is actually working for, and what type of post-16 education system you think we really need to sort of deliver the types of social justice that we would want to see. And I don't think I've come to Gary first yet. So Gary, no pressure.
I mean, I'm minded. I just want to go back a little bit to even pre-16 of talking to someone in Scotland about some of the schools around where I live. I live in Hackney, which are kind of run like boot camps. They're academies, and if you walk on the wrong side of the corridor, you can get a detention. There's a range of really ridiculous things like that. And this guy who worked in the Scottish Parliament saying to me, "But how do you build good citizens out of that?" And I thought, what's really, really sad is that nobody's really asking that. They're asking, how do we get a certain group of children to this college? Not what will they be like when they get there, and not what will their capacity be like to be kind of, active, valuable kind of human beings. And so kind of my feeling about education is that it should never stop. And that kind of having done my French HE college, FE college, pardon me, and then gone on to university. And at the FE college, I was mostly with pensioners who they were going on holiday. They would go to holiday every so often to France, and they wanted to keep their French up. And I was kind of the youngest in the class by about 40 years. The French I learned, I realized when I went to university, was old age pensioner French. I knew all the words like hip replacements and kind of, all sorts of ailments and accessories, wheelchairs and stuff like that. And that kind of, it was a wonderful thing to be a part of, actually. I used to look forward to those Thursday evenings when I was doing A-level French, that was. And so it feels pretty clear that the function of education to them is to produce units of labor. to kind of turn out a kind of workforce, not to enrich your mind, not to create good citizens, not to encourage critical thinking. Now, of course, one of the arguments that's used is that, well, everybody pays for this in taxes, and then only a few people get to, get to benefit, and that it's indulgent. But that's the case for having more people in the education system and broadening the education system so more people can use it. It's not like working class people benefit if the people who do end up going to university, many of whom are working class or through FE, are kind of turned into automatons, or are kind of have this very narrow suffer this very narrow notion of what education is for. So I studied to be an interpreter. That was my degree, in French and Russian, in translation and interpreting. And it was through studying to be an interpreter that I realized I didn't want to be an interpreter, but that I was really interested in language, and that I did, I really enjoyed the way that language could be manipulated, and it took me somewhere else. There's no way you could have drawn a path from the beginning to the end. I didn't know where I was going to end up. But I think that's fine. I think that there is a kind of overly determined, and it's quite interesting for a group of people who claim freedom, the Tories, who claim a kind of that they are the harbingers of freedom, that when it comes to intellectual freedom, when it comes to the kind of joy of roaming through a library or a canon, or creating your own canon, or whatever it would be, that suddenly the plug is pulled and it's like, no, that's not for you. Our kids, they'll do the classics. Our kids will do the classics. Well, I don't see nobody speaking Latin, or I mean, if I was Catholic and went to church, I would, fair enough. But I don't see people speaking ancient Greek. But they do teach ancient Greek in the posh schools. They do Latin in the posh schools. They have lots of art in the posh schools. In the posh places, they understand that they're educating a full human being. And so the narrow labor unit stuff, that's for the plebs. That's all you're useful for, and there's no reason why we should stand for that.
I'm trying to be really professional, but I just want to be like, yeah, because I could not agree more with everything you've just said. And Sonia, I can see you nodding along, so I don't know if you want to come in.
Yeah, as in, I completely agree with everything that Gary just said. And I get so frustrated with this, this discourse that we hear that higher education should be reserved for the academically excellent adolescents, the middle class kids. And I guess I think about my mum's story, in that she came to this country when she was 13. Went to lived in the council estate in Manchester. Went to a state school. She wasn't particularly bright. Didn't do that well at school. She said to me she was more concerned with boys than books. And also she was in her weekends and her evenings, working in a factory. That was having a few pounds in her pocket was more important than doing her homework. But this was the 70s, and it was free to go into higher education. She got a maintenance grant, so she could go and leave home. And she did a diploma, which then got converted into a degree. And yes, it was, a stepping stone for her into employment, into a profession, but also that education, and I guess, she probably doesn't even see it like this. That education gave her the that little bit of fuel to, not enough, but a little bit of fuel to start to address those structures of oppression that were there to determine where she was meant to be in life. And that's the power, of education. And that's the power that we are denying to so many people. And I think we are really regressing here. And I think particularly, Faiza said, but when I went to university, I felt very awkward, and and I'm from a good background, but 75% of my course was private school, and there was no one there like my mum, and I feel like there's we are going backwards in this sense, and that power of education, we're denying it to a lot of people in this country, and I think that's really, really worrying, and we need to be fighting back against that.
Thanks for that. And I think what you've said will really resonate with so many of our members who are watching this, and, people in related and networked communities, because, I've said so many times that there's obviously such an agenda to prevent, as you say, more people kind of getting into those life-changing opportunities. And I think seeing it as structures of oppression and denying people actually the articulation of how you even acknowledge that that's what it is, to then say that that's a structure of oppression that we need to find out a way to actually go about dismantling is really important. And I think that was what university gave to me a lot of the time, the actual articulation of things that I kind of knew, but I'd never really been given the language to talk about. Faiza, do you want to add anything in terms of what you think we could do to sort of make this better?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of a part of the narrative, and, Gary and Sonia are talking about that sort of wider education, but I really think it's also about, we don't have an education system anymore that gives people a second chance. You basically either have to get it right at like 16 or and that's it. That's the only opportunity. I have someone in my family who just about managed to get into uni, but dropped out due to mental health issues. And then, basically couldn't go back to university when they were ready, and ended up moving to Sweden where they could go to university for free. And we all have these stories. Like my dad used to do a night school. My mum did night schools at some time. Like that, those doors just aren't there anymore. They're not open to people in the same way without, it's not as easy, it's not as cheap. And that's really not the kind of society that we want to live in, where we don't give people a second chance, because lots of people don't know what they want to do or get things wrong when they're 16. I mean, and we can have a whole conversations about GCSEs, but it's really not an education system that is enlightening, right? And I think I've heard you say this before, Joe, about universities and further education colleges, schools. They're meant to be our most enlightening places, and yet they are places that exclude, that further entrench the class hierarchy, that make people feel more worthy or less worthy, that develops people into consumers at a very young age. So instead of a thirst for knowledge, which is something that my mum gave me, a sort of similar story to Gary and his French teacher in terms of tricking us into going to school, but that sense of knowledge and learning and just educating yourself is just not part of the system anymore. And that is why we are, so many young people come into the system and find they are making decisions that don't necessarily make them happy, or lead them into work that doesn't necessarily make them happy, or is fulfilling. And that, it's quite striking. Like, we did this paper with ECU and a number of academics called A New Vision for Further Education and Higher Education that was out last year, and you can find it on the class website. And we just, the essays that were written looking from, further education to social mobility, the issue of social mobility, to the way in which universities aren't often safe spaces, it just really struck me that, who is the university working for? Actually, it struck me one day when I was speaking after Gary, that was outside Goldsmiths University. It was like a strike, and Gary went up first before me, and I was like, oh no, I don't want to have to follow this. Gary spoke about love, and it was just amazing. But I remember looking around, and it was like university lecturers, it was university staff and cleaners, it was students, and I was like, all these people are angry with the system. This is not working for any of them. Students are in debt. These cleaners aren't getting paid enough, not given due respect. The pensions are being cut of lecturers, and I just was like, this is, and meanwhile, universities are on the brink of going bust. this is not a system that works in any way. So unless you're a chancellor getting paid an obscene amount of money, like, it doesn't work for anyone else. It makes no sense.
Completely. Oh, go on, Gary. Yeah.
Well, just to follow on from what Faiza said there is a kind of parallel with when they talk about COVID and they say we have to get the economy going again. And I think, well, who's the economy for? Who's it for? Because if it's our economy, it's not good to me if I'm dead, or if my granny's dead, or if it's putting people's lives at risk. I should be able to send my kid to school without fear that they're going to contract, or pass on this thing. And it's a similar thing, I think. But well, who's education for? Is it for this system? And if the system isn't for us, then why isn't education for us? Why isn't it for the things we want to do and the way that we want to live? And somehow it's taken out of being something that we own and put somewhere else in the service of something else, which is kind of may have something to do with us or may not, but it's not us at the center of it. So it's kind of, well, what is this system for?
Completely agree with that. And I think if I can speak on behalf of people who work in education, and my background before I was elected was HE, but there are all these proxies that measure you, that then control you, that determine whether or not you even get a fixed term contract rather than a 0-hour contract, get a permanent contract if you stay in the game long enough, or you've got the bank of mum and dad to help you hang around. And all of these things then is when you get into your role, prevent you really being able to be, if you're a teacher, the type of educator that you were saying, Faiza, the type of person that can actually reach out to students and actually be a corrective to the model that's developed. And I think what has been interesting that's happened, and this has not just been in higher education, we've seen it in further education and adult ed as well, is there have been these spaces that have opened up to actually reimagine education and educate the whole human being in the way you were saying, Gary. And I think from UCU's perspective, a lot of those have been the teach outs that have happened on picket lines, where actually, staff who have to do a particular teaching agenda because that's what they teach in the department that they're in, and have maybe ended up doing research that they're not that interested in, but it's actually what gets funding, and therefore they've had to kind of tweak their real passion. Or, you're a professional service member of staff who doesn't have any research in your contract. Actually, there were people on teach outs teaching things that they really cared about, teaching something that was nothing to do with their professional life. And I think actually making genuine connections with students that they don't have the time to in the working lives that they have. And I think, I think one of the reasons that you've seen that real connection that you were saying, Faiza, between, the portering and the cleaning staff, and some of the academic staff, professional service staff, and students is everyone is on the receiving end of this rotten business model. Everyone is expected to be the shock absorber of this rotten business model. And, everyone is at risk of outsourcing at some point, and precarity trickles up. And the entire system is really grinding to a halt. And I think one of the things that we're saying with this campaign is, we need government funding for the immediate saviour of jobs. We're looking at, a 2.5 billion shortfall. We're looking at 30,000 jobs potentially in HE, 60,000 across the economy. It's huge. But what we're also saying is this system doesn't benefit everybody. And actually, we really have to take stock and say we are building for better here. And I think your contributions have all really kind of underpinned that this isn't just us saying this, and we're wanting to reach out to every community and really get people behind this campaign, because, I think that there is a feeling that COVID has really laid bare and exposed the worst injustices we face. Finally, a global conversation has started about defunding the police. In one of the earlier sessions, we were talking about, addressing racism in our public institutions, particularly education, particularly healthcare. The session just before us was talking about prisons. I was wondering if we could maybe take that and if you could give some sort of concluding thoughts really to what role you think education and activism has in helping us challenge these structures of oppression that Sonia outlined, because that's really what we're about. That's what we want to do. So I've completely lost track of who's first, last and middle now. So I don't know if somebody wants to sort of nominate themselves to go first. Or I can go into teacher mode and pick someone and pretend it's a seminar.
I don't think I heard the question properly because it kind of cut out a bit.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I was wondering what you think in terms of the role that education and activism, so, you know, depending on what your kind of view is of your own role, how we can use education and use activism. So the sorts of things that we saw on those UCU picket lines are the sorts of things that we've seen junior doctors doing as well, that kind of activism. How we can use that to help us challenge these structures of oppression that we see, you know, in education, in healthcare, in our prison system, and so on, and what actual meaningful change we can elicit. Because one of the things I was talking about with Dave Smith earlier is the difference between mobilizing and organizing and actually trying to get change. Anne Pettifor, for example, was talking about how we need to capture politics, we need to get elected, and obviously that could be one answer. And I was kind of wondering what you thought about how we can use our own activism or education to really challenge those structures of oppression and change things. Just a tiny question for the end. Faiza, do you fancy it?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the thing that immediately comes to mind in terms of sort of what I've been doing as this renewed wave of Black Lives Matter protests and conversations have erupted is really to use my knowledge and my connections to bring in the new people that are coming through and to give them space and to connect them with others. So, for instance, some young people got in touch with me here and they were really interested in trying to set something more formal up, and then just giving support to those young people meeting. They wanted to meet. We met in a park. Unfortunately, a Tory councillor started tweeting that we shouldn't be allowed to meet in a park. I mean, it was an anti-racist youth group. But, you know, actually, I think it galvanized them even more that we faced that. But yeah, just in terms of, you know, what we do in this moment as someone that has had the privilege of, you know, the last 10 years of unlearning a lot of what I learned before and being much more active as a human being and as a citizen, is to really connect that. I just want to say, I just wanted to say this earlier, but I forgot, is that I guess one of the things that really struck me about you guys doing this campaign, and you know, it's great that you're doing it, but it's also kind of bittersweet that we're here, isn't it? That we have to like just defend just money going into education when, you know, so many of us can talk about our experiences of education and how important it is. My mum used to tell us about how in Pakistan, when they used to, when they tried to get her married when she was 18 or so, she went on a hunger strike so she could stay in education. And, you know, we all have these stories about how important education has been. It's almost like a no-brainer. And here we are defending just the amount of money when actually it's all the other stuff that we need to change in education. So I think, you know, for me as class, you know, it's to keep bringing out the ideas that will really change things. Like, it really struck me last week that no one said, or at least I didn't hear anyone say, that why didn't Rishi Sunak announce, instead of like vouchers for restaurants, vouchers for education? Why didn't we hear about people being able to go back, you know, whilst they're out of work? This is a voucher that gives you 1 year education or 3 years education in whatever you want, and you're going to be supported. And those are the sorts of things that are really obvious in a way, but are the sorts of radical ideas that unfortunately are radical in the way and where we are in the conversation that, you know, class and I will continue to push.
I think what you say about Rishi as well is really maps onto, you know, you see so many particular universities with the language of we are international, we want to decolonize the curriculum. And right now they're looking to get rid of their fixed term contract staff, their precarious staff, you know, who are Black staff, Asian staff, who are the ones that are actually most best placed to sort of genuinely accomplish that within universities. So I think there's a kind of a real parallel between, you know, if we want to continue education at the level that we have it, we need all hands on deck. We don't need a system that's actually seeking to cut the most valuable contributions and voices that the system needs.
Can I just, sorry, one thing I just wanted to say to the people listening, I mean, just be rebels. Be rebels. Go out and teach what you want to teach anyway. And I'm sort of hearing that from teachers that I'm meeting, like next year they're planning to do like Black History Month completely differently. We just got to be rebellious and use the spaces that we have to do what we need to do, and not to just teach an agenda that we know keeps everyone in their place.
Heavily concur. Sonia?
Yeah, I think education and health to me are very similar, and I believe both are, I guess, access to both is, you know, should be lifelong and universal. And I strongly believe that the marketization of both the healthcare system and the education system is really corrosive, and you should be fighting against that, and fighting for, you know, a publicly funded higher education system is really important, because I do believe that the profit motive undermines, you know, the core values and the core principles. And again, that's the same for health and education. And then I guess, yeah, just again, you know, I agree with Faiza, be rebels. I think we need to make sure that we don't allow our education institutions to become, you know, I guess, exam churning factories that are, you know, teaching individuals to be, you know, individualistic. And rather, we need to make sure that our education systems are, you know, inclusive and democratic, and, you know, nourishing students and empowering them so they're able to understand the world that they live in, and have that, you know, have that confidence and that imagination to challenge the world that they live in as well. And that's so important. And then finally, again, same with the healthcare system, the workers, so the educators, but all the workers in both the systems need to be empowered to do so, and that means paying them properly and giving them the time and the resource and the space to really nourish the students as well.
Completely echo all of that. Gary?
I kind of think that, and I mean, I'm 51. I think it might be that the older you get, the more difficult this is. I don't know, but we actually need to follow the young people, actually, and sustain them. They're already walking out. They're already out for climate change. They are kind of massively overrepresented in the Black Lives Matter. I mean, they understand that, first of all, they have a future to defend. You know, we're barely out of the last economic crisis. We're about to go into another one. They're stealing their future. We're Brexiting. We're doing all these things that are kind of robbing them of what comes next. And they're already out there. They're out there, you know, they've been out there kind of before us in a range of ways. And I find young people incredibly sophisticated, actually, about a lot of this stuff, because they've been schooled in austerity and war and hypocrisy and racism, and they are kind of they're very well informed, and they're very, very sharp. I interviewed Stormzy kind of November, and apart from anything else, I mean, he's incredibly handsome and he's a really good singer. He's bloody clever. He's really, really clever man. He's a really clever man, and he's, you know, I think he could still buy an Interrail ticket if he wanted one, which he probably could. He doesn't, but I mean, he's a young guy. So we have the kind of, you know, an enormous amount of talent out there, and that kind of my experience of being an activist, student union activist, and an active trade unionist in the NUJ before I joined the UCU, is that part of your education is fighting, that it's empowering, and even when you lose, you learn, and that kind of, you know, if you don't fight, you're going to lose anyway. And there is a kind of there are a range of ways in which we educate ourselves by kind of taking it on and trying to do something about it. And in this case, and here I just want to back up what Sonia's saying there. A defense of the notion that education is a social good, that it is not something to be bartered or sold or marketed, or to understand students as consumers and us as well. It's a social good. Try ignorance. If you think education is expensive, try ignorance. And so we have a kind of responsibility to each other, actually, to defend this thing. That I'm old enough that when I got my grades, I could go to university. I got a full maintenance grant. There were no loans. When my mum died, I got a bit more money to keep me in university. I graduated. I was the last year to graduate without debt. And if we could afford it then, we could afford it now. And it's a hideous shame, and it's also a shame that the Labour Party actually had quite a lot to do with why that's not possible. But that kind of we are a rich country, and so the question is not one of whether we have the resources, but whether we want to spend the resources there, or whether we want to spend them elsewhere. And I think that what we see in Pfizer and in Sonia and in others is money well spent. Money well spent. You could not buy that intelligence. You could not buy that kind of sophistication. That's kind of you can't trade it. That is an investment, and that's an investment that we all benefit from.
Completely agree. And you know what else you can't buy and trade? The type of attitude and tenacity that you're talking about that young people have. That even though, you know, the system is kind of doing its best to rob them of opportunities and of ambition that they can change the world, they're not having it. And every platform, whether it's at the TUC or a UCU picket line that I have shared with youth climate strikers, they have a crystal clear and insightful analysis of the capitalist system and exactly what is wrong with it and why it needs changing. And that is why I'm going to take one more opportunity to plug our Fund the Future Green New Deal event, which is happening on Thursday, which has all manner of student activists in it. And one of the best things this year that UCU has done is really made serious and sustained links with the student union and student movements, because I couldn't agree more with the kind of concluding remarks of what you're saying, that not only do teachers and people who work within educational institutions need to continue being rebels and taking control back and saying this is what we're doing, and I think we've been doing that, but really making those links. So I'm going to say thank you. This has been a really fascinating hour. Thank you so much for giving up your time. And I'm sure we'll see each other at future events. But thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.
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 And I just wanted to take this opportunity to thank everyone who stayed with us all evening. I hope that you have found this interesting. If you would like to check out the whole range of future events that UCU is hosting, you can go to fundthefuture.org.uk/events. Some of these are more focused at UCU members, there to help our members campaign and resist any kind of institutional attempts at cuts that our institutions are trying to push through right now. They're there to help you organise, they're there to tool you up. Some of them are more sort of campaigning events like this, more kind of building of communities and really pushing forward the message of what we're trying to do. There's some really important events coming up that are to do with our GTAs, they're graduate teaching assistants and other precarious staff that work in education. I would really encourage everybody to tune in for those events because we are really going to be pushing forward with trying to communicate, not just in our communities, but through broader communities, the extent to which our educational institutions are really built on business models of exploitation, how important it is that those jobs are not just preserved long term, but are fundamentally protected now. And we need as many people as possible to keep promoting this campaign, to keep creating the noise that will help us get where we need to. So thank you everyone for tuning in. As I say, check out the events page. There's lots more where this came from. And if you are able to, do please give us a donation. The UCU Fighting Fund, you can find it if you go onto our website, and share all of this on your social media. And thank you once again, and good evening.